In a corner forgotten by time, where the whispers of the wind intertwine with the song of the streams, the nymphs inhabit. Beings of an impossible beauty, wrapped in an aura that seems to stop the world around it. Its mere presence transforms any place into a sanctuary, a sacred space that keeps the essence of the eternal. No one who crosses with them is the same again. Not because nymphs speak with words, but because their existence is a language that touches the soul. Nymphs are not goddesses, although their beauty can be confused with Aphrodites. Nor are they simple mortal, even if they walk along the same paths as us. They are something different, something unique. Daughters of nature itself are born from rivers, forests, mountains, and seas. They have no beginning or a clear end, they are simply there, as if they had always been. Their existence does not seek a reason, because they themselves are the reason. The dew of the morning, the breeze that caresses the face, the murmur of a stream, all that are them. There is something in his eyes that disturbs and comforts at the same time. Looking at them is like remembering something forgotten, something deeply rooted in the human, natural, true. His hair seems woven with sun rays or moon shadows. Their voices, if they decide to sing, are able to stop the most fierce wars. But it is not only their beauty that makes them so special, but that connection with life itself, that ability to be present in a way that mortals could never understand. It is said that nymphs have an eternal youth, but it is not the same youth that man is looking for. It is a youth that is not marked by time, but by the constant flow of nature. Each movement of his looks like an echo of the waves, a dance of the leaves, a sigh of the earth. They do not age, they do not die. However, they are not invulnerable. If your source of life, the river, the tree, the mountain, is damaged, they also feel it, as if they were an extension of that world they protect. In myths, they appear as companions of the gods, although they prefer to maintain a certain distance. Artemisa, the hunter, chooses them as her faithful followers, while Dionysus finds in them a wild spirit that fits with her celebrations. Some say that Zeus, always eager for new conquests, tried to win the favors of more than one nymph, but they are not easy to possess. Their essence does not belong to anyone but to the place that saw them born. However, not everything that surrounds them is calm and goodness. There is a mystery that surrounds them, a fragility that makes them even more irresistible. In the darkest nights, when the moon is hidden and forests are filled with shadows, some say they heard their crying. It is not a human cry, but something deeper, older, as if the pain in the entire world concentrated on those distant voices. They may cry for the tall trees, by poisoned rivers, by the wounded mountains. Or maybe they cry for something we will never know. Pastors, travelers, and poets who find them often do not know whether to bless their fate or curse it. An encounter with a nymph can be the most sublime experience or the beginning of an endless madness. Because, although they do not seek to harm, the intensity of their presence can be too much for a human heart. In that contrast lies its nature. They are a gift and a warning, a reminder of the beautiful and the terrible thing that the natural world can be. Despite this, men have looked for them for centuries, trying to decipher the enigma they represent. Some build altars in their honor, leaving offerings of honey and milk in the holes of the trees or on the banks of the streams. Others invoke them in songs and poems, waiting to capture even a fraction of their grace. But nymphs are not shown by whim. They only appear when they want, who they want, and always with a purpose that nobody else understands. There is something almost cruel in his indifference to human affairs. They do not love like us, they don't suffer like us, they don't live like us. And yet, in its existence, we find reflections of our own aspirations and fears. They are a mirror that shows what we could be if we abandon our ambitions, our struggles, our obsession over time. But who can really do that? Who can live like them, so free and linked at the same time? Perhaps the nymphs are nothing more than a reminder, a whisper of nature that tells us that there is still beauty, that there is still life. Or maybe they are something else, something we can never fully understand. But that doesn't matter. Because just know that they are there, somewhere, taking care of forests, rivers, mountains, and seas, to feel that the world still has some of magic. And while humans continue to build, destroying, looking for answers, they continue in silence, observing, waiting, being. In the heart of the world, where nature breathes without interruptions and time seems to stop, there are nymphs. Not as spectators of that landscape, but as its very essence. Each tree that rises majestic, every river that winds towards the horizon, every mountain that challenges the sky, and every wave that breaks against the shore carries inside the soul of a nymph. They are the living spirit of nature, their voice and beat. When a river flows strongly, its crystalline song is the echo of a Naiad, a nymph of the sweet waters. In the forests, each sheet that moves to the beat of the wind keeps the laugh of a Dryad, a nymph who lives in the trees, taking care of them as if they were part of their own body. The mountains, with their imposing and silent presence, hide the Oceanids, who travel their paths with a grace that the ground never touches. And the seas, vast and indomitable, are the home of the Naiads, who dance with the waves and calm the storms with a whisper. The link between nymphs and nature is so deep that one cannot exist without the other. When a tree is talled without respect, the Dryad who lives feels a pain that transcends the physicist. If a river is contaminated, the Naiad that protects it loses part of its strength, as if its life is diluted with water. Nymphs not only take care of these elements, they are an extension of them. They cannot be separated, because separating them would mean breaking the world's own balance. In forests, Dryades are silent witnesses of everything that happens under the treetops. They feel the creak of the roots under the earth, the dance of the shadows at the afternoon, and the murmur of the animals that find refuge in their home. They don't need words to communicate, its connection with the forest is total, a constant dialogue that only they understand. Some say that if one closes his eyes in the middle of a forest and listens carefully, he can hear the whisper of a Dryad, a sound so subtle that seems to come from the heart of the earth itself. The Naiads, meanwhile, are the soul of rivers and lakes. In calm waters, its presence is like a distant song, a whisper that invites calm. But when the rivers overflow and the currents become furious, they are there, guiding chaos with a force that is not seen but feels in each drop. It is said that those who have been lucky, or misfortune, to see a Naiad describe their movement such as the flow of water itself, unpredictable, hypnotizing, impossible to stop. The Oceanids, on the other hand, inhabit where the earth rises to the sky. In the mountains, its presence is a mystery, a secret kept between the stones and the winds that hit the tops. They are not easy to find, but those who venture at the top of a mountain on a clear day have a light presence, a sigh that seems to come from anywhere and everywhere at the same time. Oceanids are strong, such as the mountains that protect them, but also carry a loneliness that feels in each cold breeze that descends from the heights. They are silent guardians, observing how the world changes from their eternal watchtower. And then there are the Naiads, the daughters of the sea, who dance to the rhythm of the waves and take care of the depths. Their laughter is confused with the sound of the tides, and their songs, fishermen say, can even calm the fiercest storms. But they are also unpredictable, such as the same ocean that generates them. Sometimes, they guide navigators to safe ports, in others, they let them face the indomitable forces of water. Not because of evil, but because they know that the sea does not give up anyone. The most fascinating nymphs is that they do not need to be seen to feel. Just be in a forest in silence, next to a quiet river, or in front of the infinite sea to notice its presence. In every corner where nature manifests itself in its purest state, they are. Not because they want to be venerated, but because they are part of that life, of that balance that humans often forget. There is something deeply sad and beautiful in its connection with nature. The nymphs are immortal while their surroundings remain intact, but the world changes, sometimes too fast, and with each forest that disappears, with each river that dries, with each mountain that is wounded by man, the nymphs feel a loss that they cannot stop. They don't shout or fight. They simply exist, holding what is left, waiting, perhaps, that one day everything is again as it was. In the calm nights, when the world seems to stop, some people say they felt their sadness in the air. A whisper, an echo, a beat that comes from the heart of the earth itself. And the lament of nymphs, a reminder that everything is connected, that nature and we are one, although we often forget it. And while the forests continue to grow, the rivers flowing, the mountains rising and the sea breathing, they will be there. Because nymphs are not just part of nature, they are his soul. In the vast and complex stories of Greek mythology, nymphs arise as flashes of life, daughters of the earth, water, and air. They are not omnipotent or human gods, they are an intermediate spark, a bridge between the gods and the natural world. Its origin is wrapped in stories that mix poetry, mystery, and the powerful connection between the divine and the earthly. According to the ancient myths, the nymphs were born when the cosmos had already begun to take shape, at a time when the earth, Gaia, and the sky, Uranus, the primary element, still ruled. From Gaia, the universal mother, many of these entities emerged as an expression of its inexhaustible fertility. It was said that every time a new source sprouted, a forest flourished, or a mountain rose, a nymph emerged along with that part of nature. They were created to be eternal guardians of those spaces, to make sure that chaos did not consume the beauty that the gods had shaped. In some versions of the myth, the nymphs are descendants of the ocean and Tethys titans, the great parents of the waters. From them inherited the liquid grace of the rivers and seas, and thus the Naiads and the Nereids were born, guarding the sweet and salty waters. Other stories link them with the union of Gaia and other primitive beings such as the god Rio Aquilou, who, according to tradition, generated several of these aquatic entities. The Dryads, on the other hand, are deeply intertwined with the trees, in particular the oaks, considered sacred by the Greeks. It was said that when a tree sprouted, a dryad was born with him, and while the tree lived, she would also live. This link was so strong that any damage to the tree could hurt or even destroy the associated nymph. They were not simple protective, they were the very spirit of the tree, breathing with him, growing with him, dying with him. The Oreads, inhabitants of the mountains and hills, were often seen as daughters of the gods of heaven and earth. Some ancient texts describe them as born of the echo of the winds that hit the rocks, or as part of the breath of the gods when they mold the high summits. For this reason, they were considered carriers of an indomitable force, a reflection of the imposing nature of the mountains that inhabited. What makes the origin of the nymph so captivating is their direct connection with natural cycles and life itself. They were not created as warriors or as protagonists of great heroic deeds. They were generated as guardians of harmony, reflecting the fragility and strength of the natural world. Through them, the Greeks explained the natural phenomena, giving each river, each forest, each hill and every wave of a face, a soul, a purpose. Ancient poets and writers could not ignore their charm. Homer, in the Odyssey, mentions the nymphs with silent reverence, placing them as beings that operated out of human reach, but whose actions directly influenced everyday life. Hesiod, in their Theogony, places them among the minor divine generations, born of the gods but deeply rooted in the physical world. For them, nymphs were not just characters, they were a way of understanding and relating to a world full of mysteries. However, not all nymphs shared the same exact origin. In the different regions of Greece, legends varied. Some communities considered them manifestations of the local gods, while others saw them as independent spirits, created by the landscape itself. This diversity in its stories and lineages reflects the richness of Greek mythology and its ability to adapt to the beliefs and needs of each people. In the midst of these stories, the nymphs were established as a symbol of the eternal and the ephemeral. Although its existence might seem immortal, its destiny was inextricably linked to the elements they protected. If a forest disappeared, his dryad perished with him. If a river dried up, its naiad disappeared in oblivion. This dual and natural, eternal and fragile origin is what gave them a special place in the hearts and minds of the ancient Greeks. Thus, the nymphs were born not only as guardians, but as a reminder of the unwavering connection between the gods, humans, and nature. And while their stories continued to evolve, their essence remained intact, that of being the immortal daughters of an ever-changing world, whose beauty and vulnerability reflect one's own condition itself manner. In the stories of Greek mythology, the nymphs always moved into a delicate dance between the divine and the earthly. Although they were not Olympic goddesses, they shared a deep relationship with many of them, especially with those whose spheres of influence touched nature. Their connection with the gods not only raised them as key figures in mythological stories, but also revealed the complexity of the interactions between the eternal and the perishable. Zeus, the king of the gods, had multiple meetings with the nymphs, and not all were simple stories of protection or worship. In his often impetuous, Zeus was attracted to the incomparable beauty of many of them. One of the best known was Callisto, a devout nymph of Artemisa, who swore chastity in honor of the hunting goddess. However, Zeus, disguised as Artemisa, managed to seduce her. This act not only marked Callisto's fate, later transformed into Ossa by Heros' fury, but also showed the vulnerability of nymphs to the power of the Olympic gods. Apollo, the god of music, poetry and light, also maintained a deep connection with nymphs. He often looked surrounded by them, especially the Naiads, who found in their melodies a source of inspiration. One of the most tragic stories was that of Daphne, a nymph of the Penio River. Pursued by Apollo, who loved her intensely, Daphne begged her father to save her from that unrequited love. In response, she was transformed into a laurel, a tree that Apollo consecrated in her honor. This episode not only underlines the close relationship between Apollo and the nymphs, but also the constant tension between the divine desire and the autonomy of these free spirits. Artemisa, the goddess of hunting and protective of forests, had perhaps one of the most harmonious relationships with nymphs. They were their most loyal companions, sharing with her the secrets of the forest and the freedom of natural landscapes. The Drysi and Oread nymphs were an integral part of their courtship, hunting by their side and ensuring that the purity of the forests remained intact. However, loyalty to Artemis came with a price. Those that broke their chastity vows or betrayed their confidence faced their anger, as was the case of Callisto. Despite these punishments, Artemisa represented for the nymphs a model of strength and autonomy in a world dominated by the male authority of the Olympic gods. Poseidon, the god of the sea, also shared a special connection with the Nereids, the ocean nymphs. He considered them his spiritual daughters and guardians of the deepest secrets of his domain. One of the best known was Deities, who, although desired by Zeus and Poseidon, ended up marrying the mortal fight, giving rise to the birth of Achilles. The Nereids not only served Poseidon, but also acted as intermediaries between mortals and the power of the ocean, helping or punishing navigators according to the will of God. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, saw in the nymphs not only companions, but also allies in their pranks and adventures. Their relationship with them was lighter and more playful, and in some stories there is even talk of love encounters with them. Hermes respected their independence and considered them as free spirits as himself. But not all relationships between gods and nymphs were loving or friendly. Hera, Zeus's wife, often saw the nymphs as rivals due to the constant infidelities of her husband. His anger not only fell on Zeus, but also on the nymphs involved, punishing them with transformations or exiles. This dynamic shows the vulnerable place occupied by nymphs in the pantheon, admired for their beauty and connection with nature, but often trapped in the conflicts of the gods. The nymphs, despite their immortality and their link with nature, were not untouchable. Their relationship with the Olympic gods placed them in an ambiguous space, sometimes privileged and other times dangerous. They were venerated, desired, and protected, but also persecuted and punished. Each encounter with a god brought a change, whether it was a blessing or a curse, an honor or a tragedy. Through these interactions, nymphs became a reflection of the complexity of the Olympic gods, their passions, their defects, and their power. But, beyond being simple instruments in the hands of the gods, the nymphs demonstrated a silent strength. Despite the adversities, the forests, rivers, and mountains continued to live, remembering men and gods that nature always finds a way of persisting. Throughout the centuries, the nymphs have maintained their lovely and mystical essence, although their representation has evolved according to needs, values, and the ideals of each era. From the ancient stories of Greek mythology to modern interpretations in art and literature, these figures have been molded, reinterpreted and, sometimes, stripped of their original meaning, but have never lost their ability to fascinate and move. In ancient times, nymphs were seen as living, inseparable entities of nature. They lived. The Greeks imagined them as guardians of rivers, forests, and mountains, female spirits that represented the vitality and mystery of the natural world. They were venerated figures in local rituals and ceremonies, especially in rural communities where connection with the earth was essential for survival. Their representations in ceramics, fresh, and sculptures of the time showed them as beautiful young people, in soft and ethereal forms, often accompanied by mythological gods or heroes. They were not mere ornaments in these stories, but symbols of life, fertility, and renewal. With the rise of Rome and its adoption of the Greek culture, the nymphs acquired a new dimension. The Romans, more pragmatic in their approach to the divine, maintained the image of the nymphs, but integrated them into their worldview. The Latin poets as Ovid included them in their stories, emphasizing their beauty and their relationship with the gods, but also highlighting their vulnerability and humanity. In works such as the Metamorphosis, the nymphs became protagonists of tragedies, marked by persecution and sacrifice, reflecting the tensions of a society that already began to distance himself from his spiritual connection with nature. With the arrival of Christianity, the nymphs faced a radical change in their representation. Pagan figures, linked to nature and polytheism, were considered incompatible with new faith. During the Middle Ages, the nymphs were relegated to a secondary role, demonized or reinterpreted as feric beings, distant from their mythological roots. However, its essence survived in popular stories, where they transformed into fairies, sirens, or forest spirits, keeping their connection with the wild and mysterious. The Renaissance marked the resurgence of nymphs as symbols of beauty, artistic inspiration, and connection with nature. At this time, artists and poets rediscovered the classic texts and, with them, to the nymphs. Painters like Sandro Botticelli immortalized them in works such as The Birth of Venus or Spring, where they appeared surrounded by gods and mythological figures, radiating a subtle sensuality and a natural grace. In Renaissance poetry, nymphs were celebrated as muses, guardians of creativity and passion. During Romanticism, nymphs were seen again as symbols of the sublime, the indomitable and the unattainable. The poets and painters of this era represented them as melancholic and mysterious figures, inhabitants of wild landscapes and idyllic scenarios. Nature, in Romanticism, was a place of refuge and spiritual rediscovery, and nymphs embodied this search for the pure and authentic. They became unattainable yearning metaphors, reflecting the internal conflicts of the human being in the face of a world in transformation. In modern and contemporary art, nymphs have adopted new forms, adapting to the cultural and technological contexts of each moment. In the literature of the 20th century, authors such as H.D. Hilda Doolittle and other modernist poets resumed nymphs such as resistant symbols, autonomy, and spiritual connection with nature, challenging the patriarchal narratives that had reduced them to mere objects of desire. In cinema and popular culture, nymphs have reappeared as mythical figures, often linked to the genre of fantasy, where both beauty and the danger of the unknown represent. At present, nymphs have also found a place in ecological and feminist debates. As guardians of nature, they have become emblems of the struggle for the conservation of the environment, reminding us of the importance of protecting the ecosystems that they embody. Likewise, as independent female figures and close to the natural, the nymphs have been reinterpreted as symbols of empowerment, resistance, and connection with the essential. Despite centuries and cultural transformations, nymphs remain deeply emotional and evocative figures. Either in the ancient Greek stories or in modern works, its essence transcends time, inviting us to reflect on our relationship with nature, art, and our own humanity. Their representations, although changing, maintain a constant thread, a reminder that the beautiful, the fragile, and the mysterious will always have a place in our stories. The murmur of the water has always a refuge for the human soul, a song that calms and connects with the deepest of our essence. In Greek mythology, this link acquires form and name in water nymphs, the Nereids, the Oceanids, and the Naiades. Each of these figures embodies a different facet from the waters that give life to the world, from the unfathomable depths of the oceans to the whisper streams that wind through the valleys. His presence not only beautifies myths, but also reflects the spiritual and vital importance that the ancient Greeks granted to water. The Nereids, daughters of old Nereo and Oceanida Doris, live in the oceans, being their guardians and ambassadors. They were 50, a symbolic number that highlights its collective character and omnipresence in maritime stories. They are often described with hair that shine like the foam of the sea and agile bodies like the waves. Their main task was to protect the sailors, guiding them in their journeys and calming the storms that could threaten their lives. But the Nereids were not only protective figures, they were also capricious and strong, like the sea itself. Thetis, one of the most famous, is remembered as mother of Achilles, and her story is marked by the dilemmas and passions that only one deity of the sea could understand. In the most mysterious depths, the Oceanids, daughters of the ocean titan and the titan-eyed Thetis, govern the vast domains of the oceans and seas. There are thousands, a crowd that represents the immensity and diversity of waters. Each Oceanida has a unique role, either taking care of sea currents, rains, or even underground sources. Although they often remain in the background compared to the Nereids, their importance is indisputable. They are the invisible architects of the balance of water in the cosmos, responsible for maintaining harmony between the oceans and the earth. In contrast to the amplitude of the Oceanids and the majesty of the Nereids, the Naiades reign over the sweet waters, rivers, lakes, fountains, and springs. If the oceans are the lungs of the world, the sweet waters are their heart, and the Naiades are their constant beat. These nymphs are deeply territorial and are closely linked to human communities that depend on the rivers and streams that protect. They were worshipped in local rituals, offering flowers and food to ensure their favor. However, like any force of nature, Naiades could be as generous as ruthless. It is said that, if someone contaminated their waters or challenged them, these nymphs could unleash disease or misfortunes. The emotional connection of these nymphs with water is not accidental. The ancient Greeks understood that water was not only a physical resource, but also a symbol of life, renewal, and purification. Each movement of water, each reflection on the surface, was seen as a manifestation of these divine entities. The Nereids, Oceanids, and Naiades were not simple mythological figures, but the personification of a living, vibrant, and sometimes implacable natural world. But his relationship with humans was not always harmony. The stories are full of encounters between mortals and aquatic nymphs that end up in indelible tragedies or lessons. The men who tried to possess them, attracted by their beauty and mystery, used to face the fury of the waters. On other occasions, the stories highlight the melancholy of these nymphs, who, being immortal, observed how the rivers and streams that they loved changed and disappeared over time. That mixture of power and vulnerability makes them deeply human figures, despite their divine nature. Art and literature have immortalized these aquatic nymphs on innumerable occasions. In old frescoes, the Nereids appear riding on marine dolphins or monsters, carrying coral crowns and pearls. Oceanids, although less visually represented, inspire an aura of mystery and greatness that resonates in the Homeric hymns. The Naiades, meanwhile, star in bucolic poems and pastoral scenes, always close to earth and human emotions. However, beyond words and images, there is something intangible that water nymphs awaken in those who approach their stories. It is that chill that runs through the skin when listening to the roar of the waves or the murmur of a stream. It is the sensation of connection, belonging to a world where everything is in constant flow, where each drop of water has a purpose, a destination. They, the Nereids, the Oceanids, and the Naiades, are that eternal echo, reminding us that the water not only satisfies our thirst, but also our spirit. And while the rivers run, the seas rugen, and the springs sprout, these nymphs will continue present, observing, waiting, vibrating in each drop, as if the whole world will breathe through them. The whisper of the leaves in a forest, the crunch of the branches under the feet, and the sweet aroma of the resin that emanates from the trunks are much more than simple manifestations of nature. In Greek mythology, these signs were the voice of the Dryad and Meadows, forest nymphs. Ethereal beings that inhabited the trees, represented the sacred connection between mortals and tree life that gave shade, food, and refuge. Each forest had its spirit, each tree its protector, and together they wove a framework of life that was both beautiful and fragile. The Dryads are the guardians of the trees, especially of the oaks, which were considered sacred by the Greeks. These nymphs not only protected forests, but were an integral part of them. The life of a Dryada was linked to the tree that inhabited. If he fell, she also perished. This deep link symbolized mutual dependence between humans and nature. Perhaps that is why the Dryad ones were often seen as kind figures, but capable of punishing those who damaged their home. They tell the stories that the Dryad ones often appeared in the moonlight, dancing between the trunks and leaving traces of their passage in the flowers that sprouted from the earth. Its beauty was serene, almost hypnotic, and many travelers who admitted themselves in the forest swore to have heard their laugh mixed with the wind. But getting too close to them, trying to desecrate their space, was to risk facing their anger. It was often said that the forests where the Dryads lived were sacred and that no axe could touch their trees without fatal consequences. On the other hand, the Meadows, sisters of the Dryads, were born from a divine seed, daughter of Gaea, the earth, and from the spilled blood of Uranus. These nymphs were specifically associated with ash, trees that, for the ancient Greeks, represented strength and resistance. The Meleiades were protective of the warriors and the heroes, because of the ash the spears and weapons were made. But they were not distant or detached figures. It was said that they felt in their own flesh the wounds inflicted by the weapons that were born from their trees. Both Dry and Meleiades shared a unique relationship with Artemis, the goddess of hunting, forests, and wild nature. Artemisa was her protector, and they, in turn, were her companions in the forests she traveled with her arch in hand. The presence of Artemisa in her myths reinforces her connection with the wild, with the indomitable. Just as the goddess protected forest animals, these nymphs took care of trees and natural landscapes. Artemisa, like them, did not tolerate the free destruction of nature. His fury was as relentless as that of the Dryads when someone dared to break the sacred balance of forests. The stories of these nymphs are full of emotions found. On the one hand, their connection with the trees gave them a long, almost immortal existence. On the other, that same union made them vulnerable. A fire, a ray, or a lumberjack's axe could end their life. This contrast between power and fragility reflects the relationship that humans had with forests, a source of life, but also a resource that they should use with care and respect. The Greek poets and artists did not take long to capture the figure of the Dryads and the Meleiades in their works. In the frescoes, they looked intertwined with branches, almost indistinguishable from the trees they protected. In the poems, their voices were described as sweet and melancholic, a reminder of the transience of natural beauty. For those who lived near the forests, these nymphs were more than myths. They were a tangible presence, a spirit that made each tree something sacred. However, not all stories of these nymphs are good and harmony. Some stories talk about their ability to take revenge on humans who desecrated their forests. If a sacred tree was carved, the drift associated with him could bring curses to whom he committed such an act. Diseases, misfortunes, and even death followed those who did not respect their space. These stories were a constant reminder that forests were not only resources, but also living sanctuaries. The Dryad and the Meleiades were, in essence, a mirror of the relationship that the Greeks had with nature. In their myths, we find lessons about respect, balance, and interconnection between all ways of life. And although these stories were counted ago millennia, their message remains powerful in a world where forests still need human or divine guardians. The cold wind blows strongly on the heights, stroking the steep rocks and the snowy peaks of the mountains. In these places where few dared to venture, the ears inhabited, nymphs that embody the spirit of the mountains. They were majestic figures of a wild beauty that reflected the strength and hardness of the landscape they called home. Invisible in the eyes of mortals, but always present, the ears represented the indomitable purity of nature, their ability to inspire and, at the same time, instill fear. Each mountain had its own ears, and its characteristics were linked to the essence of their home. Some were cold and distant like snowy peaks, others, warm and cozy like the hills covered with flowers. Their presence not only gave life to the mountains, but also made them sacred spaces. Travelers who ventured along the steep and dangerous paths offered prayers and sacrifices to win the favor of the ears. They, in their generosity, could guide the lost or protect those who showed respect for their domain. However, these nymphs were not only guardians. They were also muses for poets and artists, who found in the magnificence of the mountains an inexhaustible source of inspiration. The ears were the echo that resonated between the canyons, the breeze that caressed the faces, and the whisper that urged the dreamers to reach the unattainable. His spirit was a reminder that even in the most inhospitable places, beauty could flourish. On the other hand, the Naiads, sisters of the Oceanids, also inhabited the heights, but their history was more intertwined with parenting and care. According to tradition, these nymphs played a crucial role in the childhood of the powerful god Dionysus. It is said that the Naiads raised him on Mount Nisa, a mythical place whose exact location has been lost in time. There, in the tranquility of the mountain, they protected him from Herod's anger and fed him with honey and milk. Under his care, Dionysus grew to become the god of wine, ecstasy, and fertility. The history of Naiads is a reflection of the duality of nymphs, delicacy and strength to the same extent. Although his work was tender and maternal, his ability to fabricate what they loved should not be forgotten. If someone dared to endanger the child they had sworn care, the Naiads became implacable guardians, capable of unleashing the anger of the mountain itself to defend it. The symbolism of these mountain nymphs is deep. The ears represent the connection between mortals and the sublime, that human impulse to look high, to the big and unattainable. They are the voice that reminds us that there are heights that deserve to be climbing, not because we will find at the top, but for what we discover in the process. For their part, the Naiads embody the idea of refuge, to find comfort even in the most solitary and remote places. The legends say that on the nights of full moon, the Oceanids and the Naiads gathered at the heights to dance. His dance was as light as fog and as powerful as thunder. The mortals who were fortune, or misfortune, to witness this show spoke of an overwhelming feeling, a mixture of fear and admiration. You could not look at these nymphs without feeling the immensity of the world and the smallness of one's existence. Although the Oceanids and the Naiads did not seek to interact frequently with humans, those who managed to earn their favor found invaluable allies in them. The Oceanids could guide travelers by safe paths or even provide strength to the warriors before battle. The Naiads, meanwhile, offered comfort and protection, like a mother who watches over her children. But any act of disdain or lack of respect towards your home could unleash disastrous consequences. The mountain could collect revenge through avalanches, sudden storms, or the simple loss in its natural labyrinths. Mountain nymphs not only inhabited the physical landscape, but also the heart of those who understood their message. They were a reminder of the need for balance between admiration and respect, between the desire to conquer and the obligation to take care of. And although his presence felt in fresh air and in the solemn silence of the heights, their true essence lived in the stories that the ancient Greeks told about them. Stories that, even today, invite us to look towards the mountains with other eyes. The sun gently caressed the meadows, illuminating a vast sea of golden grass that moved to the wind from the wind. In that landscape of infinite serenity, the Naiads and Eleutherides lived, the nymphs of the meadows and open fields. Often invisible for mortal eyes, these deities lived among wild flowers, the furrows of the cultivated fields and the clearings where animals grazed. His presence was subtle, but powerful, because they existed, life flourished in abundance. The Naiads were known for being the guardians of fertile meadows. Each belly bellow, each flower, and every insect that buzzed in the air carried their blessing. In harvest times, farmers offered silent sentences to these nymphs, asking that the fruits of their work were abundant and that the fields continued to be generous. They, in their benevolence, responded by ensuring the fertility of the earth, while the warm winds that blow in the summer afternoons carried their whisper. But the Naiads not only protected nature, they also had a deep link with humans. In the oldest stories, it was said that they appeared in human form to help the peasants. Perhaps a young woman with a brilliant look and hair adorned with flowers approached the field one day, offering advice on when to sow or how to take care of the ground. If mortals followed their advice with gratitude and respect, the Naiads rewarded their devotion with crops that overflowed abundance. On the other hand, the Eleutherides, a freer and faster group of nymphs, were associated with the open fields and the vast territories where nature ran without restrictions. These nymphs represented pure freedom, the connection without ties between mortals and earth. His dance was manifested in the movement of wild horses that ran through the fields, on the flight of the birds that drawn circles in the sky, and in the fresh aroma of the wild herbs after a rain. Both types of nymphs, although different in their nature, shared a common purpose: maintain the balance and beauty of the meadows. Without them, the fields would become sterile, and life, as the Greeks understood it, would lose their essence. Therefore, the ancients dedicated festivals in spring, when the flowers began to sprout and the days became longer. It was believed that when celebrating their presence, the Naiads and Eleutherides danced among mortals, ensuring that the next life cycle would be prosperous. The Naiads and Eleutherides were also a symbol of human fertility. Many stories spoke of women who, unable to conceive, asked for the help of these nymphs. On full moon nights, baskets full of flowers and fresh bread were offered in open fields, while future mothers recited prayers from the heart. If the nymphs felt moved by the sincerity of the petition, they blessed women with the fertility they so longed for. However, these nymphs also had a fierce side. If humans damaged meadows with selfish or foolish acts, the earth became sterile as punishment. The ancients said that Lymachides could unleash lobster pests or invoke endless droughts if they felt their home was desecrated. But even in his anger, his goal was not to destroy, but teach respect for the earth, remembering mortals that nature was not only a resource, but a sacred gift. Among the most moving legends about the Lymachides is the story of a shepherd named Albio. As they count, this young man took care of his flock in a particularly beautiful meadow, where each spring the fields were filled with poppies and margaritas. Albio, humble and kind, always left a part of his harvest as an offering for the nymphs. One night, while sleeping with his flock, an ethereal figure appeared before him. It was a gold-haired Lymachide and eyes like honey. Without saying a word, he touched the land around him, and at dawn, Albio found his field more fertile than ever. But the most extraordinary thing was that, from that day, his flock never got sick or getting lost again. The Lymachides and Eleutherades were not just myth beings, they were a reminder of the intrinsic connection between humanity and earth. In his stories, there is the teaching that fertility is not only a physical act, but a spiritual exchange. Loving, caring and respecting the environment was, and remains, the key to living in harmony. When the sun disappeared behind the horizon and the sky was dyed purple, the ancients believed that the Lymachides and Eleutherades danced in the shadows to the rhythm of the cicadas. His dance was a celebration of life, a silent song that only open hearts could listen. Those who stopped their passage to observe the fields in those magical hours felt a chill to travel their skin, as if the nymphs spoke to them, reminding them that the beauty of the meadows should never be taken for granted. Heaven extended to them as an infinite mantle, covering everything they knew. But for those who had the power to look beyond the stars, the sky was not only a vacuum ocean. In the vast heights, between the stars and the constellations, the Oceanids, the nymphs of the sky. They were beings of etheria, capable of weaving the connection between the earth and the cosmos, beings that, with their presence, maintained the delicate balance of the universe. Every night, when the moon emerged from its dark refuge, the Oceanids danced among the stars. With their bodies of light and hair that shone like comets, they wove the invisible threads that united the destinies of men with those of the gods. They were guardians of the celestial vault, in charge of the movements of the stars, stations, and winds. Not only observed from the heights, they were the ones who ruled him, with a soft firmness that only a heavenly being could possess. His relationship with heaven was not a mere symbolism, but an active force. The Oceanids had the power to influence the destinations of mortals, because, in some way, heaven reflected the desires and struggles of men on earth. Each constellation was a story of love, sacrifice, or tragedy that gave them life. On storm nights, it was said that the Oceanids argued among them on the decisions made by the gods, and their discussions were reflected in the lightning that illuminated the sky. But the Oceanids were not just authority figures. They were also like mothers and older sisters of the stars, protectors of life that developed under their gaze. Each star in the firmament was, in their heart, a soul that they cared for and guided. The sun, the moon, and the stars were born and died at their rhythm, but always under their vigilant eye. Greek legends narrated how Oceanids helped the Olympic gods in times of crisis. On the day of the great battle between the Titans and the gods, the celestial nymphs extended their influence to ensure that the order of the universe was maintained. It was said that, with only one gesture, the Oceanids could alter the course of the stars, make the moon change its phase, or that the sun was hidden for longer, which could influence the struggle between the divine powers. However, not all stories were so great or full of power. There were tragic stories, too, that they talked about Oceanids who, when invoked by desperate mortals, were trapped in the destinations of those whom they wanted to help. One of the most heartbreaking stories was Selene's, the moon goddess, who fell deeply in love with a mortal called Endymion. But his love was convicted of his own destiny, since Selene could only look at him from the heights, while he, plunged into an eternal dream, could never look at her back. In his pain, the moon Oceanid went down every night by his side, wishing to be able to touch him, but always helpless before the destination that had been imposed on him. And although the Oceanids lived in the vastness of heaven, they also shared a unique relationship with the gods of Olympus. Zeus, Apollo, and Artemis, among others, used to consult the celestial nymphs when they needed knowledge about what would happen in the future. The Oceanids, with their ability to read the movements of the stars, could foresee the result of great battles or the future of the mortal heroes. But above all, they had an unwavering loyalty to the cosmic force that had created them, and never allowed mortals to alter the natural course of the stars. There was a particular Eurynide that stood out in the legends, Tessis, a nymph who ruled the celestial ocean. He was Uranus's wife, the primary god of heaven, and together they took care of the sky and the stars that inhabited him. Tessis, with his immense wisdom, became the mother of stars, and said that when he cried, his tears fell like rains on earth, giving life to rivers and lakes. Despite their power, Eurynides were not alien to sadness and suffering. There was talk of how they could also cry in the dark of the night, creating rains that fell like blessings on earth. When humans suffered from wars or losses, Eurynides felt their pain, and sometimes they gave a soft rain, like a comfort, to relieve sorrows. The relationship of the Eurynides with the sky was more than a power connection. It was a life alliance, where they, with their immortal presence, maintained the cosmic balance. The light of the stars was not just a distant glow, it was the reflection of the emotions, desires, and stories of the Eurynides. Each star that shone in the vastness of the firmament was one of its stories, a memory of a lost love or a sacrifice made for the good of the universe. Every time someone looked up to heaven, he could, in silence, feel the presence of the Eurynides. They didn't need to be seen to be felt. His energy flowed through the stars, illuminating the dark nights with the promise that, although the earth was mired in shadows, there would always be light. The light of the Eurynides, which would never go out. In the depths of the earth, where light never comes to play, where silence extends like a heavy mantle, the Tonies, the underground nymphs. They were mysterious beings, wrapped in the shadows and dust of eternal darkness. No one saw them, but everyone knew they were there. It was the guardians of the darkest secrets, those who knew the forgotten routes, the hidden passages, and the murmurs of the souls that traveled to their final rest. The underworld, governed by Hades, was not just a place of suffering and punishment, he was also home to the Tonias. They were not known for their beauty or their grace like other nymphs, but for their connection with the deep, with the heart of the earth itself. In the bowels of darkness, they were the only ones who walked freely, those that could move in the shadows as if they were part of the landscape, merging with the roots of the dead trees and the water that flowed underground. His relationship with Hades, the god of the underworld, was complex. Although they were not their daughters or their wives, the Tonias served as their assistants, their guardians, and their emissaries. When the souls of the dead came to their destination, the Tonias accompanied them on their last trip, guiding them through the cold and dark tunnels. It was not an easy or fast trip, each step was a reminder of eternity that awaited them at the end of the road. The Tonias took them calmly, without hurry, without fear, because they themselves knew the weight of oblivion. There was something deeply sad in its existence. Unlike the other nymphs, which lived near the light, the Tonias did not experience the change of the stations or the warmth of the sun. The world of Tonias was stillness. And although they were often described as fearsome figures, what really terrified of them was the calm with which they accepted death and darkness. They were nymphs that did not fear what others fled with all their might. For them, the underworld was not a place of suffering, but of existence, a kingdom where peace was that life could never offer. The legends about them were scarce, but those that existed talked about how the Tonias moved as shadows, almost invisible to mortal eyes. Some said that they could only be seen by those who approached too much to the kingdom of the dead, those who had already crossed the threshold of life and death. There was talk of people who, when they died, felt their presence before entering the underground world. It was a whisper in the dark, a gentle friction, like the wind that caresses the skin, but that froze the soul. It was said that, when the Tonias did not guide souls, they spent their time in the deepest caverns, where groundwater sang melodies that only they could hear. It was a sad song, a farewell and welcome song, a song that resonated in the depths, but that never reached the surface. In these places, the Tonias not only took care of souls, but also guard the secrets of the dead. They knew everything that had happened before someone crossed the other side, and they were the ones who decided if the memories should be forgotten or preserved. His relationship with the underworld went beyond being simple guides, they were part of their fabric itself. The roots of the earth, the currents of groundwater, the movement of the rocks, everything was interconnected with them. Sometimes, it was said that the Tonias themselves were born from the earth itself, from the dust of death, and that they were not completely divine or completely mortal, but something intermediate, creatures of the end, daughters of death and darkness. Unlike forest or rivers nymphs, whose emotions were connected to life and creation, the Tonias knew only the end, the conclusion of the cycles. They did not feel love or anger like the other nymphs, they felt something much more gloomy and deep: acceptance. And that acceptance, although cold and distant, was what gave them their power. They did not fear at last because, for them, the end was just the beginning of something else. They lived with eternity in their eyes, and that is why their contact with souls was so different from the other nymphs. It was not a relationship of comfort or joy, it was a relationship of respect, a relationship with silence. But in his silence there was wisdom, because every soul that passed through their hands carried a lesson, a fragment of life that the Tonies brought and kept in the dark. They didn't talk much about what they saw, but their eyes knew everything that could be known about life and death. They were like the echo of a forgotten sigh, which never disappears, that is trapped in the rocks, in the vitiated air, on the earth itself. The Tonias had no need to be understood, they did not even want to be feared. They were only. In his serenity, in his pas oscura, remained as eternal figures that observed the passage of time, not sadly, but with a deep calm that only death can offer. No one saw them, but everyone knew that, without them, the cycle of life and death could not be completed. It was a sacred link with the earth, a connection that linked them to the soul of the earth itself. And although they would never see the sunlight, their existence was fundamental for everything to continue its course. The Tonias, like immortal shadows, continued on their way to the underworld, keeping the secrets of death, making sure that, at the end of everything, the cycle never breaks. In the vastness of nature, the nymphs were the guardians of the elements that gave life to the world. Each of them was a perfect reflection of the fundamental aspects of the earth. They were not mere creatures of ethereal or fantasy beauty, they were living forces, incarnations of the essential elements that formed the fabric of reality. In his eyes the fire of the sun shone, in his voices the whisper of the wind resonated, and in his movements the energy of the earth and the water flowed. The nymphs not only inhabited forests, rivers or mountains, they were those same places, as if their bodies were an extension of nature itself. It was in this deep bond where his power resided. The nymphs were not limited to being simple mythological figures that adorned the legends, they were the manifestations of the elements that humans revered and feared. The trees flourished when the dried ones took care of them, the seas roared and calmed when the Nereids danced in their depths. The valleys were filled with life when the nymphs of the meadows wove their magic between herbs and flowers. Thus, the Olympic gods could walk on the earth without anything getting between their walk and the course of the elements, because they knew that the nymphs took care of every corner of the world. For humans, nymphs represented much more than the simple concept of beauty, they were the soul of nature itself, the invisible thread that linked everything that existed. Each element had its own nymph, as if the very essence of the physical world was cared for and protected by these magical beings that inhabited and protected the earth. The dried, for example, were the protectors of the trees. Each tree had a nymph that defended it from those who tried to damage it. It was said that a dryada could feel the suffering of his tree, that his soul merged with him. When the tree died, the dryada also did, because there were no separately from each other. This deep connection reflected the essential role of nymphs in the maintenance of natural balance. Plants, trees, air and earth were living beings, with their own souls, and the nymphs were their guardians. Water, that essential element for life, also had its own type of nymph, the Nereids, the Oceanids, and the Naiads. There was something hypnotic in the relationship of these nymphs with water. The Nereids, like daughters of the sea, could calm the storms and made the waves slide gently on the coasts. The Naiads, the nymphs of the rivers and springs, slid as reflections in the clear waters, purifying everything they touched. Each current, each lake, each river was a reflection of the purity of the soul of the Naiads. They not only lived the bodies of water, but they kept them alive, protecting their waters from pollution and dryness. Without them, the flow of life would have stopped. The wind, that invisible current that crosses the mountains, valleys, and cities, also had their nymphs. The Oaloas, nymphs of the wind, could make the air stirred or calmed down to their will. With the whisper of their breath, they could cause the winds to caress the skin of those who surrounded them, or raise a man to the heights. The winds that bleed in the meadows or caress the slopes of the mountains were not simply air, they were the breath of nymphs, impregnated with their essence. Nymphs, being the very personification of natural elements, were not only in charge of protection, but also for the renewal of the natural world. They were the guardians of the cycle of life and death in nature, preserving the necessary balance for the world to continue working. The spring flourished thanks to them, while winter remained calm until the stations turned again. But not only the elements were their domain. Nymphs were also the echoes of life itself. In their dance with fire, water, earth and air, nymphs wove an invisible mantle of harmony, which united each living being in a perfect cycle. They were the spark in which everything came to life, the whisper that maintained order in chaos. When the nymphs walked through the earth, the sun seemed shining with more force, the air became lighter and the flowers grew higher. The earth responded to them, as if nature itself listened to its steps. However, despite their power, nymphs never looked at themselves as controlling world. They were simply the custodians of a greater balance than themselves. They knew that their existence was part of a whole, and that if they ever depart from their mission, the world's natural cycle could crumble. They did not ask for reverence or worship, only respect and understanding. His work was silent, but its impact deep. It is difficult to imagine life without them, because their presence was impregnated in everything around us. The mountains that touched the sky, the meadows that extended like green carpets, the rivers that flowed with unstoppable force, everything was his work. Even the smallest of the insects that perched on a flower was part of the delicate framework that the nymphs maintained with their magic. If the link with their element was ever broken, the whole world would feel their absence. Thus, in their role as personifications of natural elements, nymphs not only ruled the tangible aspects of nature. It was the souls of the earth that inspired respect and amazement, that maintained the delicate balance between chaos and harmony. Without them, the world would be an empty place, a lifeless space or meaning. Because nymphs were not just part of nature, they were nature itself. Nymphs were the very manifestation of beauty, a beauty that did not know limits or the passage of time. It was a perfect reflection of eternal youth, a youth that never faded, which never withered. In his faces a radiant freshness shone, a purity that seemed to challenge the laws of nature. They were perfect in their form, but that perfection did not come only from their exterior appearance, but from the very essence of their being, which was pure and free as the air that surrounded them. In the Greek world, where the gods mixed with humans, nymphs represented more than eternal youth. They were the unattainable ideal, perfection in their purest form. They were the promise of beauty that would never fade, that would not suffer the traces of time or wear of the years. This symbol of eternity was something that humans yearned and admired deeply, but at the same time, he left them with a sense of sadness. The beauty of the nymphs was so fleeting in their human nature, so impossible to achieve, that it could only be admired from afar, as a brilliant star that is seen in heaven but can never touch each other. The nymphs moved as if they were the same personified youth. His walk was light, almost ethereal, as if floating above the physical world. Every gesture they made, every laugh that escaped their lips, seemed to reflect the joy and vitality of endless youth. You could not find in them a single wrinkle or a trace of exhaustion. They were always radiant, as if their youth were permanently sealed on their skin, in their eyes, in their hearts. This quality made them so desirable, so unattainable, that their presence was a constant reminder that true perfection could never be achieved by mortals. The symbolism of their beauty and youth was not only a reminder of what humans could not have, but also a warning about what eternity could mean. Nymphs, being immortal, would never know physical wear, but would not know change either. They were eternally beautiful, but condemned to a static life, without the transformations that define human existence. While mortals age, change, and sometimes they fade, the nymphs remained the same, as if their beauty had been trapped at a frozen moment. In his perfection there was a silent sadness, because perfection itself lacks the beauty of the transformation. The eternal youth of the nymphs was something that went beyond physical appearance. They represented the desire to always remain young, of not being touched by the passage of time. The mortals, seeing them, wanted this eternity, this life in which nothing vanished, in which everything was perfect and brilliant. But the price of this perfection was disconnection with the natural flow of life. While humans got rid of their youth to embrace wisdom, nymphs could never understand this process. They were beauty creatures without history, without footprints to tell. They, with their infinite youth, could not understand the truth of life, that true beauty is found in the transformation, in the ability to grow, in the scars that mark the passage of time. For the gods and heroes who saw them, the nymphs were the epitome of the desirable. Many of them fell under their spell, wishes Nando possessed them or even get their beauty to be given. But love for a nymph was always an unattainable love, because its beauty and youth could not be captured or possessed. They were free, always fleeting, like a beautiful dream that vanishes when you wake up. No mortal, not even the luckiest of the heroes, could claim a nymph as his. Although the nymphs offered their beauty as a gift, there was always something intangible in them, something that could never be fully possessed or understood. In their symbolism, nymphs are erected as a contradiction. They are the incarnation of the perfect and eternal youth, but at the same time, they are a warning about the dangers of remaining motionless, of not allowing time to transform them. They are eternal and beautiful, but their life lacks the dynamics that makes the human world so vital. In the background, the nymphs represented a golden dream that humans could not reach, but never stopped dreaming. Eternal youth, endless beauty, was a fantasy that would never lose its appeal, but that would never materialize in reality. The nymphs, with their perfection, were a reminder of the fragility of human life, of the beauty that is lost over time and the inevitability of the transformation. In every corner of the Greek world, nymphs were erected as symbols of what everyone wanted and, at the same time, what they could never have. His youth, unwavering and radiant, was the sun that illuminated the earth, but also the moon that could never be reached. And so, the history of nymphs is also the history of unfulfilled dreams, of the desire of something that will always be beyond the reach of human hands, an eternal sigh that remains in everyone's heart. Nymphs were much more than simple representations of beauty and eternal youth. They were the guardians of the natural world, the beings in charge of protecting the kingdoms of the earth, the forests, the rivers, the seas, and the mountains. They were the defenders of life in their purest form, struggling to maintain balance and harmony between the elements. His presence was a silent promise that nature would be careful, respected, and preserved. At every step they took, the nymphs sown the land of life, making sure that the vegetation flourished, that the waters run clean, and that the animals were protected in their habitats. These creatures not only existed to decorate landscapes, but they played a fundamental role in the protection of the elements that shaped them. The Dryad, for example, not only inhabited the trees, but merged with them in such a way that their life was intertwined with that of the forest. If a tree was damaged, the Dryada suffered. If the forest was threatened by a fire or by the indiscriminate cutting of trees, the nymph fought with all its strength to prevent it. Water nymphs, such as the Naiads and Oceanids, protected the seas and rivers, making sure that the waters were kept pure, that sea creatures lived in peace, and that humans did not disturb the balance of the oceans. If a ship entered into forbidden waters, nymphs were responsible for diverting their course, protecting marine life and, in some cases, even punishing humans for daring to challenge the laws of nature. This link with nature also connected them deeply with the stations. The nymphs were the ones that announced the arrival of spring, the flowering of flowers, and the abundance of the harvest. When winter was installed and the earth covered with ice, the nymphs retired, but never disappeared completely. They knew that every cycle should be fulfilled and that, in the end, spring would always return. It was his role and his duty, protecting what was within his reach, making sure that nature followed his course and that the balance never breaks. The power of the nymphs was not only physical. They possessed an inherent magic, a connection with the elements that allowed them to communicate with the creatures of nature, heal the sick trees, calm the storms, and bring the rain when necessary. His magic was not destructive, but protective. They were the safeguards of life, the beings that defended the earth without expecting anything in return, moving between trees and rivers as shadows, ensuring the welfare of their world. And not only was it about protecting the nature of external threats. The nymphs were also those that cured the earth when it was injured by the hand of man. They knew that humans, although part of nature, could damage ecosystems with their actions. If someone cut a tree without respect, if they hunted indiscriminately or contaminated a river, the nymphs did not hesitate to act. Some of them had the ability to make the crops fail, that the rivers will overflow as punishment for the damage done. Others, more benign, but equally powerful, simply taught humans to respect nature, their laws, and their beauty. However, the nymphs were not omnipotent. There were times when humanity was so destructive that they could not even avoid complete devastation. Man, in his arrogance, sometimes believed that he could master nature. But there was always a hidden lesson in the acts of the nymphs, a lesson of humility. Nature, with its beauty and power, could not be controlled, but only respected. And the nymphs, in their protection work, were the silent teachers of this lesson. Nymphs also manifested as a symbol of what humanity could lose if nature did not take care. His beauty, his youth, and his magic came directly from the earth. They represented the abundance of forests, the freshness of the waters, and the vitality of the fields. Without them, without respect for nature, nymphs could not exist. Somehow, nymphs were the reflection of the balance between man and earth, between creation and destruction. They were the guardians, but also the reminders that life is fragile, and that the harmony between all living beings is what survival ensures. In mythology, the love that nymphs felt for nature was pure and unwavering. It was not just a love for what they saw with their eyes, but for the very essence of life that lived in the wind, on earth, and in water. For them, protecting nature was not a duty, but an intrinsic part of its existence. They lived for this, they breathed for it, and each of their actions was a manifestation of that deep and unconditional love for the natural world. The connection of nymphs with nature was sacred, a bond so strong that it could never break. In their silence, in their quiet presence, the nymphs watched over the welfare of the earth, of heaven, and the sea, teaching humans that true beauty is found in harmony among all beings. They, in their serenity, reminded us that nature, like the same nymphs, should be cared for, respected and loved so that it would never cease to be a refuge of life and beauty. Nymphs were not only beauty and mystery creatures, but also the bearers of fertility itself, beings responsible for giving life to everything that grew, created and reborn on earth. In his hands was the power of the fruitful earth, the ability to transform the dry into green, the dead in living. They were responsible for the cycle of life, who assured that the cycle of nature followed its eternal course, renewing with each station, with each day. Throughout the times, the nymphs were deeply associated with fertility, not only on earth, but also on living beings that depended on it. The connection of nymphs with natural cycles, with the flow of life and death, was written in their very essence. Its presence in forests, in rivers, in the fields, and in the mountains was a constant reminder that everything that is born must grow, flourish, and bear fruit. But also, like them, everything must die to give way to a new cycle. In the ancient Greek myths, the nymphs were the guardians of this regeneration. The Dryads, the nymphs of the trees, for example, not only took care of the forests, but were seen like those that gave life to the plants, flowers, and fruits. Their proximity to the trees gave them the power to directly influence the land that surrounded them, making sure that the trees flourished strongly in the spring and that the fruits could be collected in the summer. Each leaf sprout, each flower that opened to the sun, carried a piece of the soul of the nymph that had protected it. And in the fall of the leaves, in the cycle of the death of vegetation in autumn, there was also its mark, marking the return to the Renaissance. But the fertility of the nymphs was not limited only to the plants. They were also those that brought fertility to animals. The rivers, forests, and meadows in which the nymphs were inhabited were places where life abounded, where the cycle of procreation never ceased. The nymphs acted as caregivers, preserving the necessary balance for life to be reproduced. Its presence was a symbol of the ability of the earth to maintain a constant flow of new life. The rivers, as their domains were seen as sources of inexhaustible life, a channel that never ceased to flow, which always brought something new, something fresh. Even love and procreation among human beings were influenced by the magic of nymphs. In ancient Greece, it was believed that those who asked for help to nymphs, especially those who lived near forests or rivers, they could receive the blessing of fertility. Rituals and offerings were celebrated to honor them, asking for the abundance of harvest, but also for the fertility of human fields, in marriages, in the arrival of children, in the prosperity of the family. Somehow, the nymphs acted as mediators between the human and the divine world, making sure that life followed their course and that humans could enjoy their fruits. The bond of nymphs with fertility also reflected a deep aspect of Greek mythology, the eternal connection between life, death, and rebirth. The nymphs were not only the creators of life, but also those who accompanied her in her pace. Through them, life always found a return. It was as if the earth itself took breath with each new spring, and the nymphs breathed that life through its magic, multiplying it and holding it in balance. This fertility power of nymphs was seen not only as a gift for human beings, but also as a reflection of divine power itself. In many myths, nymphs were descendants of gods or cosmic forces, almost immortal beings who were born from the very principle of life. Its beauty was, therefore, a visual representation of the fertility of the earth, the youth that was always renewed, the hope that nature would never stop giving. It did not matter how many winters they would arrive, how many stations would pass, the nymphs would continue to be the renewal soul of the earth. This power they possessed was also linked to their protective nature. It was they who cared for the cycle of life, who prevented something or someone interfering with the natural order. If any human being or creature dared to alter the delicate balance of fertility, the nymphs intervened. Many times, if someone cut a tree without respect or hunted more than necessary, the nymphs took revenge, bringing pests or curses that affected the harvest or the animals. This power to punish or bless was rooted in its deep understanding of life itself. The fertility of nymphs, therefore, was not only an act of generosity, but also of discipline. They were the guardians of an eternal cycle that had to remain intact, of a natural law that could not be broken without consequences. And so, the nymphs were still responsible for maintaining nature in balance, of ensuring that everything on earth followed its natural course. Through them, the love for life remained alive, and the cycle of existence never stopped, always continued, always started again. In the echoes of the forests, the whisper of the wind between the branches or the song of the waters in the rivers, the nymphs, although always beautiful and charming, carried a duality that could never be ignored. His magic was not only that of beauty, fertility and protection, but also that of an indomitable force that, if it was unleashed, could be as dangerous as the same wild nature they inhabited. Nymphs were like stations, always changing, sometimes serene and sometimes as implacable as a storm. The beneficial aspect of the nymphs was what everyone knew. They were protective, those who watched through the fields, forests and rivers. They were the force behind the fertility of the earth, the soul of growth, life itself. Those who managed to win their favor could live calmly, knowing that the cycle of life would continue their course without obstacles. The nymphs, with their sweetness and grace, inspired peace. An encounter with them, either in the twilight of a forest or next to the calm waters of a river, was like a respite for the soul. In the presence of these creatures, everything seemed to make sense, everything seemed to flow harmoniously. But not everything in Greek mythology is so clear and peaceful. The nymphs, on their most gloomy side, showed overwhelming force, such as nature itself when it becomes uncontrolled. Sometimes, its beauty was just a trap, a siren song that attracted men towards perdition. It was said that dark forests, the most remote corners of the mountains, and the abysses of the rivers were territories where the nymphs could be shown in their most dangerous form. There, where mortals ventured without knowing what awaited them, the nymphs could become ruthless jackets, capable of dragging those who disobey them to the beyond. The desire for them, when it was not reciprocated or simply became an obsession, led to the tragedy. It was easy to fall under his spell. For the most part, the nymphs were represented as lush beings of beauty, their hair floating like water, their eyes as deep as heaven, their presence a promise of unparalleled love. Men, finding them in the middle of the forest or next to a lake, were rendered before them, without realize that, at that same moment, the same nymphs that seemed cozy and benevolent, could become their worst nightmares. The nymphs could not only fall in love, they could also bewitched, to move away the men of their destinations, miss them in the depths of nature, where confusion became a condemnation. It was said that some never returned from the dark forests or the deepest waters, leaving behind only the echo of their last sigh. Water nymphs, such as Naiads and Oceanids, possessed unfathomable power. The seas and rivers, always mysterious and full of life, could be both the cradle of life and its tomb. The sirens, daughters of the sea, are linked in many legends with the nymphs, beings whose song catches travelers in their trance, guiding them to the turbulent waters where their lives are extinguished without a trace. Aquatic nymphs, like the water they represented, could be as calm and serene as a calm lake, but in the blink of an eye, transform into the most destructive storm. The men who tried to navigate through their domains often succumbed to the storm they unleashed. The ability of the nymphs of being both the source of life and death was what made them so fascinating. A field blessed by them flourished like never before, but could also suddenly wilt if any of them was enraged. A fragile flower, cultivated by the touch of a nymph, could instantly wilt if the natural cycle was altered by the human being. Just as fertility overflowed from his hands, so did anger. Greek myths show nymphs as fierce guardians, willing to punish those who dared to break the balance of nature. An offense, however small, could be enough to attract his anger, and then the beauty that he used to be drunk became deadly. The darkest side of the nymphs was not limited only to their destructive power. It was also a matter of domain. They were not only capricious creatures, but sovereign of the natural elements on which they reigned. When the men invaded their territory, the nymphs responded with a fierce defense. Often, the stories speak of heroes who, when entering, just as a goddess could bless the harvest, he could also destroy it if her land was invaded. No one who did not understand the code of respect and veneration that nymphs should escape without suffering their consequences. The duality of nymphs, so it was a constant in their stories. They represented the most beautiful and the most scary of nature. They were the goddesses of fertility and growth, but they were also of revenge and justice when the balance of the earth was threatened. In its essence, nymphs were the manifestation of nature itself, unpredictable, full of surprises, but also of overwhelming force. Those who approached them with respect and humility found their protection, but those who forgot that code of honor faced the other face of these beautiful deities, the fury of nature in their purest state. What seemed to be a blessing, sometimes, could become a deadly threat. Nymphs never ceased to be fascinating, even when they were in their most dangerous form. After all, wasn't it the same nature that, with its serenity, gave life and, with its fury, snatched it? In the hills covered with vines and the nights golden for frantic dance, the nymphs played a role that could not be ignored in the stories of Dionysus, the god of the harvest, the wine, and the wild ecstasy. Dionysus, known for his dual nature, as god of pleasure and madness, found in the nymphs not only a faithful companions, but some powerful guardians of his cult, capable of bringing both the light and the shadow. The nymphs, with their deep link with nature, were intertwined in the myths of the god with a grace that transcended the simple accompaniment. They were an essential part of the transformation that Dionysus brought to humanity. The nymphs were there, present in every corner of their history, from birth to their most dramatic moments. It was in forests and valleys, secret places where the senses overflowed with emotion, that Dionysus was received as a child, full of promises. These female deities, which resided in the most remote places of nature, not only witnessed the festivals and rituals that celebrated the god of wine, but, with their laughter and their music, they were also an active part of them. His connection with Dionysus was as narrow as the relationship that the earth and stations have. Without them, the cult of the god of fun and euphoria could be no existed in the same way. The myths tell how the nymphs, together with the Bacchantes, the most devout followers of Dionysus, danced to the sound of the drum and the frantic cry, entering a state of ecstasy that overflowed the limits of the human. During the festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the nymphs became the very force of the ritual. Not only followed the dances, but they were guided, unleashing such a powerful energy that it seemed to transform the world itself. They were responsible for invoking the spirit of nature, wine, music, and delight. In forests, in the mountains, and next to the sources, the nymphs became the spiritual mothers of everything Dionysus represented: the liberation of the senses, the connection with the natural world, and the overflowing joy of life. The stories talk about how, in their wildest moments, Dionysus found comfort and refuge in the nymph company. In his youth, the god of wine was persecuted and mistreated by those who did not understand their essence. It was in the protective arms of the nymphs that Dionysus found comfort, and it was they who took care of him when the world turned his back. The nymphs, with their quiet but unwavering strength, welcomed him, welcoming his green and wild kingdom, and giving him the freedom of being who really was, a god who did not want to be repressed, but free to dance and celebrate life. However, in the figure of Dionysus, the other face of nature was also reflected, one that could be fierce and destructive. Nymphs, with their ancestral wisdom about the cycles of life, understood that ecstasy could bring both beauty and chaos. In myths, when Dionysus lost control, it was the nymphs responsible for helping to restore balance. They were not only the guardians of joy, but also the bearers of the restoration, who knew how to heal those who succumbed to the madness that Dionysus unleashed. Dionysus's rites, with their unbridled ecstasy, were not only a path to liberation, but also towards danger. The connection with the nymphs in these rituals did not always bring happiness. The history of the Bacchantes, in particular, shows how the nymphs, when they were carried away by the force of God, could become an overwhelming force that not only celebrated, but destroyed everything in their path. At one time, nymphs, under the influence of wine and music, dragged men and women to a furious madness, and what began as a life party became a cataclysm of death and destruction. It was then that Dionysus appeared in his fiercest form, the god not only of wine, but of revenge and chaos. Nymphs, despite their joy, knew that God's energy could be as destructive as constructive. They, like the god who guided them, understood that beauty was not something eternal, that everything that goes up must also fall. His relationship with Dionysus was not only a relationship of joy, but also of suffering, since they knew that, deep down, nature itself feeds on life and death. Dionysus's nymphs were not only the participants of the feasts or those who danced with him, but they had a deep wisdom about the mysteries of the natural world. They understood the cycle of life and death, fertility and decline, and how everything that was created should also be destroyed. When Dionysus showed his most bleak face, the nymphs were the first to understand that, so that something could be reborn, he had to go through a death process. And so, his link with Dionysus, although full of joy and beauty, was also marked by the understanding that the god of wine was both a god of liberation and transgression, carrying both joy and chaos in his passage. Dionysus's cult was not only a celebration of life, but also of nature itself, with its cycles of creation and destruction. And the nymphs, in their eternal connection with the earth, were the ones who guided men and women in this wild journey. The figure of Dionysus and his followers, the nymphs between them, not only represented the exuberance of nature, but also the danger that stalked when it came to challenging the established limits. In the most hidden corners of Olympus and in the forgotten valleys of the earth, the echo of the loves of Zeus resonated as a wind of promises and betrayals. Throughout the centuries, stories of how the great god of thunder were entangled in passionate relationships with many nymphs, beings of ethereal beauty and mysterious power. But like everything Zeus played, those stories were not only made of love and sweetness. They were complex stories, where divine desire collided with the will of these immortal creatures, creating passions that went beyond human understanding. Zeus, and married to the beautiful Hera, she was never an easy god to please or tie. His eyes perched on every corner of nature, from the highest mountains to the deepest waters, and the nymphs, with their lovely grace, could not escape their gaze. In those ancient legends, Zeus entered the forests where the trees whispered secrets, or immersed themselves in the rivers where the waters reflected their majestic figure, looking for those nymphs that attracted it in an irresistible way. One of the first stories that arises is that of Zeus and the nymph Pleione, one of the 7 stars that formed the Pleiades, a constellation that never stopped shining in the night sky. Pleione, with its heavenly beauty, caught the attention of Zeus, who approached her in its most captivating form. The result of this meeting was the creation of the 7 sisters, the Pleiades, who endured in the sky, but also as an eternal reminder of how Zeus was related to the nymphs, not only to love, but also with a vision that transcended what was transcended mortal, a love that became a legend. But not only the nymphs of the sky and the stars received the favor of Zeus. The terrestrial nymphs, those that inhabited the sources, the valleys, and the mountains, were also attracted to the almighty god. As in the case of the nymph Aegina, whose encounter with Zeus on the homonym island triggered a story that changed the destiny of his people forever. In his affair with Aegina, Zeus not only showed his desire, but also his need to ensure his lineage and power. From his union the hero Echoes was born, who would become a powerful and respected king. However, the nymphs were not always easily given to the god of thunder. Many times, Zeus had to disguise or use his divine powers to captivate their hearts. As in the case of the nymph Leda, who was seduced by Zeus when he took the form of a swan. The result was another famous story that combined love and tragedy, the birth of Helena de Troia, whose beauty would unleash a war between gods and men. What really marked these stories of Zeus and the nymphs was not only the desire he felt for them, but the intensity of the emotions that the nymphs themselves experienced. Although they were immortal and divine, the nymphs were not alien to pain and internal struggle. Some, such as Callisto nymph, could not escape Zeus's hug and paid the price to be the object of their desire. After being seduced, Callisto was transformed by Hera into an Osa, a metamorphosis that reflected both unrequited love and the punishment for succumbing to the desires of such a powerful god. Although many of these stories reflected the tribulations and betrayals that marked the relationships between the gods and the nymphs, there were also moments of tenderness and understanding. In certain stories, Zeus not only showed himself as the dominant and seductive god, but as a being that understood the importance of nymphs in the balance of nature and the cosmos. The nymphs, as representatives of the natural elements, played a vital role in the world of the gods, and Zeus, in their divine wisdom, knew that each relationship with them not only had personal, but cosmic consequences. Nymphs, despite their beauty and their ability to captivate the gods, were not mere victims of Zeus's desire. Some, like the nymph Dione, or Aphrodite mother, knew exactly how to play their cards in this complicated game of love and power. Dione I, in his relationship with Zeus, not only acted as a lover but as a woman capable of influencing the divine forces, a wise who understood that, as in nature, love could be both an act of creation and of destruction. With each story, Zeus showed that his relationships with nymphs were not only fleeting passion encounters, but fundamental moments in the creation of new lineages and in the very fabric of history. The nymphs, as guardians of the natural elements, played a crucial role in the perpetuation of life, and Zeus, by loving them and joining with them, marked not only the fate of their own family, but also the course of the events that would define the future of gods and men. For every story of desire and seduction, there was a deeper echo, a reminder that, even in divine Olimpo, passions and loves could be both blessings and curses. Zeus's love for the nymphs was not only a force that transformed the nymphs themselves, but that we wove the complex plots of Greek mythology, reminding us that, in each encounter, in each relationship, in each forbidden love, there was both creation and destruction. In the stillness of a forgotten forest, between the shadows of the centenary trees and the constant murmur of the streams, Echo lived, a nymph of the mountain that had been bent aside with a melodious voice, capable of attracting the attention of any living being. But that voice, beautiful as the song of an angel, was also his conviction. Echo, with her soul full of pure love and innocent desires, she did not know that fate had marked her to live a tragedy that would resonate over time. Echo was not like the other nymphs, those that were lost in the arms of the gods or mixed with mortals. She was special, marked by the loneliness of her existence and dedication to her own song. The goddess Hera, jealous of the time that her husband, Zeus, passed with other nymphs, had launched a curse on Echo. The goddess's conviction was cruel. Echo could not speak for herself, she could only repeat the last words of those who they will talk to you. The spell made it a being caught in its own echoes, without being able to express their feelings, desires, or thoughts. He could only reflect what others said, trapped in the eternal repetition of the words of others, unable to communicate in a true way. But there was something in an Echo that could never be extinguished, his love. Despite his curse, Echo's heart was beating with a burning passion, and he didn't spend much time before his eyes perched on an immortal young man, Narcissus. Narciso, son of the nymph Liriope and the god Saphysio, was an incomparable beauty figure, a young man whose appearance caused the admiration of all the beings that knew him. However, Narcissus did not see beyond its own reflection. His self-love was so immense that no other being could be compared to the perfection he saw in himself. One day, while walking through a forest light, Narcissus stopped next to a crystalline current to drink water. It was there, in front of the liquid mirror, where he saw it for the first time, Echo, the nymph trapped in his conviction. His heart accelerated when he saw the beauty of Narciso, and with his eyes shining from love and desire, his lips muttered, without being able to avoid it, the same words that he pronounced, repeating his name, as a shadow that followed his reflection. Narcissus, hearing the voice that responded, felt intrigued. Without knowing it, he was entering a cruel game. He called, and Echo, that he could only repeat, replied, "Here." Narcissus, at first confused, thought it was another forest being, and in his selfishness, began to follow his voice, hoping to find more than himself. But Echo could not approach, since the curse kept her prisoner in her place. The two were finally found, but Echo's words were always a reflection of what Narcissus said. "I love you," she said, and he responded with a cold indifference, without being able to understand the pure love emanating from his heart. The nymph, trapped in her pain, lived an indescribable anguish. Despite her unwavering love, her beauty and her soul full of devotion, Narcissus never saw her, he never really listened to her. All he saw was his own reflection, and all he loved was his image. With the passage of time, Echo was consumed by the pain of an unrequited love, and in his despair, he retired to a lonely cave. Heros' curse had left her empty, stripped of everything that once was her being. His days passed between the shadows, with his soul broken by the disdain of Narcissus. Only his voice remained, eternally repeating the words that no longer made sense. Narcissus, he whispered again and again, like a distant echo that vanished in nothing. Narcissus, meanwhile, continued his life, but the story did not end with the indifference he had shown Echo. Destiny, as always, is cruel and just at the same time. Narcissus, by falling in love with his own reflection, ended up consumed by the obsession with his image. He could not depart from the water, he could not stop admiring in the liquid mirror that returned the perfect image of himself. Finally, consumed by his own love, Narcissus died there, in the same place where he had seen his reflection for the first time. The pain of Echo, his unrequited love, was not in vain. Narcissus paid the price of his vanity and selfishness. The tragedy of Echo and Narcissus did not end with the death of both. Echo, unable to die completely due to its divine nature, faded in the stones and mountains, and its voice continued to resonate around the world, an eternal echo of suffering and unrequited love. The gods, seeing the tragedy that had been unleashed, transformed Narcissus into a flower, the flower that bears his name, the Narcissus. And there, in the fields, his image flourished forever, a representation of his beauty and the fatality of his self-love. The echo of Echo continued to resonate in every corner of the world, a reminder that love, when it is not reciprocated, can become a prison, but also that vanity and selfishness can be the seeds of the destruction itself. The name of Echo and Narcissus is still whispered by the winds that cross the forests, the sad song of a nymph who loved without being seen, and a young man who, when looking in the water, only found his reflection. It was a common day in Arcadia forests, where trees rose as centenary giants, their leaves whispering old songs in the wind. But something was about to change, something that would forever mark the history of the gods and mortals. Daphne, the young nymph of nature, walked light between the trees, as free and pure as the water that flowed through the crystalline rivers. Its beauty was incomparable, as natural as the fresh breeze that caressed the hills. However, in his heart there was no desire for love, nor of relations with the gods who courted her. Daphne just wanted to be free, free as the wind that does not stop, like the leaves that fall without being touched. Apollo, the god of the sun, of music and prophecy, had seen Daphne in his passage through the forests. And at that precise moment, when his eyes crossed, God's desire ignited as a fierce flame. It wasn't just a passing attraction, it was a deep love, an obsession that led him to follow her throughout the forest. Daphne, at first, did not understand the intentions of God. How could such a majestic and powerful being wish her, a simple nymph? But when Apollo, with his radiant face and his imposing presence, began to approach more and more, fear seized her. She did not want to be touched by the hand of a god, she did not want to be part of a destiny that attached her to another's wishes. "Stop, Apollo," he asked him in a trembling voice, but God did not hear her. He was blinded by his own passion, for the fascination he felt for the young nymph. He accelerated his step, letting the wind guide him towards her. Daphne, with his accelerated heart, began to run. The branches of the trees were intertwined in its path, the ground creaked under her feet, but she didn't look back. Fear promoted her, the desire to escape something that could not control. Apollo followed her, her superhuman speed and her desire to possess her even more intense. His heart was beating strongly, not only for the desire to have her, but also for a need to overcome the impossible. But Daphne, despite her beauty and grace, could not escape her destiny. She ran with all her might, feeling that the roots of the forest tried to stop her, but she, more fast, more determined, only thought about freeing himself. "Why do you follow me?" he shouted, his voice broken by fatigue. "Leave me alone." However, Apollo did not understand. For him, the love he felt was all he needed, and his words became a promise to have her. "You will not escape from me, Daphne," he said, his voice full of despair and desire. You are mine, forever." The sun seemed more intensely to shine around it, as if the whole universe aligned so that Apollo got what he wanted. But Daphne, exhausted and scared, reached a clearing in the forest where there were no more paths. The shadows of the trees no longer protected it, only the blue sky remained, and the anguish of being achieved by a destiny that could not escape. It was her last attempt to flee, but her fear paralyzed her. "I don't want this," he thought with his whole being. When Apollo was so close that he could reach her, when her hands almost touched her skin, something strange happened. In a last act of despair, of rejection, Daphne raised his head towards the sky and begged for help. The voices of the gods rose around them, listening to their plea. The earth trembled, and the air was filled with a vibrant energy. At that time, the gods responded. Apollo, seeing what happened, extended his hands to touch it, but before he could do it, Daphne's body began to transform. His feet sank on the ground, his legs became roots, his skin became hard like the cortex, and his arms rose like branches that extended to heaven. In a sigh that resonated in the air, Daphne was transformed into a laurel, an eternal tree that would never lose its leaves, a symbol of purity and resistance. He was no longer there to be touched by Apollo, but his spirit remained in that tree, immortal, indomitable. Apollo, seeing what had happened, was paralyzed by grief and frustration. The love he had felt for Daphne had not only faded, but now he had become an eternal bond with the tree that represented his rejection. Although he had lost Daphne, the laurel became his emblem, his symbol of victory and pain. From that day, Apollo never stopped carrying a bay crown in his head, as a sign of his lost love and eternal struggle. The laurel tree, which arose from Daphne's despair, became a symbol of beauty that cannot be possessed, of freedom that cannot be restricted. The laurel, immortal and evergreen, represented the sacrifice of a nymph that preferred to transform into something eternal before succumb to the claws of desire. And Apollo, although he always remembered Daphne with love, knew she would never be his. He had learned, in a bitter and cruel way, that love, when forced, can never be truly possessed. The laurel, in its splendor, lived as a testament of unrequited love and of unwavering power of freedom. The sunlight was leaked through the leaves of the trees in a forest that seemed suspended over time. There, in the midst of that natural paradise, there was more than the fresh aroma of the wet earth and wild flowers. There was an almost magical presence, a whisper in the air that talked about immortal beings, protectors of the oldest secrets on earth. The nymphs watched from the shadows, their delicate and ethereal figures melting with the nature that they took so carefully. Hercules, the half-son of Zeus and symbol of Greek heroism, had come to that place in search of something that would take a step closer to fulfilling his destiny, the works imposed by King Eurysteo. But on this occasion, I was not there to face a fierce beast or a challenge impossible to overcome with brute force. This time, I needed something more intangible, something that only nymphs could offer, knowledge. The mission was to find the Garden of the Hesperides, a mystical place where the golden apples of Hera grew, a wedding gift that symbolized immortality. Nobody knew with certainty where that garden was, and the few clues that existed were vague, hidden in the wind whispers and the currents of the rivers. This is how Hercules came to the forest, knowing that nymphs would be their only hope to find the way. At first, it was not easy. The nymphs, escape and distrustful beings, observed it from a distance, questioning in silence if this imposing man, with muscles carved as marble and a look loaded with determination, was worthy of his help. They had witnessed innumerable acts of greed and cruelty by mortals and the same gods. Why should they trust him? However, something in Hercules was different. There was no arrogance in his gestures or vain words in his mouth. His purpose, although wrapped in the tragedy of his own sins, was clear and sincere. It was the nymph each who finally broke the silence. From the shadow of a willow, his voice echoed as the murmur of a stream. "Hercules," he said, his soft but firm tone, "what are you looking for in this sacred place? What could nature that you cannot take with your own hands offer you?" Hercules, surprised by the sudden appearance, inclined respectfully. "I don't come to take anything by force," he replied, his voice full of honesty. "I have come to ask guidance. I need to find the Garden of the Hesperides, but I don't know how to get there." The hero's words resonated among the trees, and the nymphs, one by one, began to get out of their hiding places. They were as fragments of nature itself, their hair reflecting the gold of the sun and its woven dresses of leaves and flowers. There was a caution in their eyes, but also a spark of curiosity. They knew the fame of Hercules, their feats and their incomparable strength, but also their errors and the weight that carried their shoulders. It was then that Erythea, another of the nymphs, spoke. The Garden of the Hesperides is not a place that anyone can reach. It is protected by an immortal dragon, thieves, and their secrets are not revealed to the impure. What makes you believe that you are worthy of our help? Hercules breathed deep. It was not the first time that he faced doubts about his intentions or his character. With a firm but humble voice, he said, "I do not know if I am worthy, but I know that I must try. My life has been marked by suffering and redemption, and this work is not just a task, it is a way of repairing the damage that I have caused." The nymphs looked at each other, as if they were debating silently. Finally, each nodded and approached Hercules. "We will help you," he said, "but you must understand something, the knowledge you are looking for is not a gift. It is a test. You must demonstrate not only strength, but also wisdom and respect for nature." With those words, the nymphs began to guide Hercules. They did not give a map or clear instructions, instead, they took him through forests, rivers, and mountains, teaching him to listen to the murmurs of nature, to interpret the signs in heaven, and to trust his intuition. It was a path full of challenges, where Hercules had to face not only physical obstacles, but also his own doubts and fears. In the process, the nymphs became more than guides. They were teachers, showing him a connection with the natural world that he, in his life as guerrero, he had never met. They taught him that force without purpose was like a river without a channel, and that true power was in the harmony between man and nature. When Hercules finally arrived at the Garden of the Hesperides, it was not only for the help of the nymphs, but also because of the transformation he had experienced on his trip. He looked back, towards the forest he had left behind, and knew that those ethereal figures, guardians of life and the secrets of the earth, would always be with him, not in physical form, but in the lessons that had left him recorded in the soul. The echo of hurried steps resonated in the valley. A young Perseus advanced with his heart divided between determination and fear. Faced with him, a landscape of mystical beauty, a corner of the world where the divine and the earthly were intertwined. It was a place where the breeze carried whispers of ancient secrets and the trees seemed to monitor with invisible eyes. He knew that he was not alone, that in some corner of that paradise the nymphs, guardians of the most precious and dangerous gifts, lived. Fate had taken him there with a clear mission: face the fearsome jellyfish and bring his head as a trophy. But to achieve this, Perseus could not only trust his courage. "I needed weapons and tools that no mortal possessed, magical relics that only the nymphs could provide." Although his fame was not that of cruel beings, the nymphs did not offer their help for no reason, and Perseus knew it. Every step that took it closer to a meeting that could change it forever. In the heart of the forest, the nymphs watched him from the gloom, his soft laugh such as the water of a hidden stream. There were three, each with a presence that emanated a different type of charm. There was something disturbing in its beauty, a glow that seemed to emerge from the purest of nature. They were not just beautiful creatures, they were forces of the earth, guardians of the sacred, and not anyone could approach them. When Perseus reached the clear, the nymphs were waiting for him, his figure surrounded by an ethereal mist that reflected the moonlight. One of them, whose hand seemed made of the foam of the sea, took a step forward. "Why are you coming here, son of Danae?" he asked with a voice as soft as the wind. Perseus, kneeling before them, he replied with humility, "I come in search of your help. My destiny is to face Medusa, but I can't do it without the objects that you guard." The nymphs exchanged looks, a mixture of curiosity and caution on their faces. They knew that the young man was not any mortal, his divine lineage shone like a flame in the dark. However, they were not convinced. A second nymph, whose hair looked like moon rays, took a step forward. "What makes you think that you deserve our relics? Those who seek to be able to end up consumed by him." Perseus looked up, his face marked by a determination that only those loaded by the weight of his destiny could possess. "I do not look for these tools for me. My fight against Medusa is not for glory, but to free those who live under the terror of their gaze. If I fail, it will be my own life that pays the price." The nymphs were silent, their impenetrable faces, while studying the young man. Finally, the third of them, with eyes that reflected the depths of the forest, spoke. "If your words are true, then we will give you what you are looking for. But remember, every object we give you carries with it a responsibility. Using them wisely is as important as the mission itself." With those words, the nymphs disappeared in a whirlwind of light, just to return moments later with the objects that would change the course of history. The first nymph extended a leather sack containing the winged sandals of Hermes. "With these, you can fly beyond the reach of any danger," he said, his words loaded with a solemn tone. The second nymph gave Perseus a golden helmet. "This is Hades' invisibility helmet. Use it when you need to disappear from the enemy's eye," he explained, his look at the young man as if he tried to read his soul. Finally, the third nymph offered him a bright shield like the purest mirror. "This is Athena's shield. Do not look directly at Medusa, use this shield to reflect your gaze and protect you." Perseus accepted each object with a mixture of gratitude and reverence. They were not just tools, they were a vote of trust of those who considered it worthy. The nymphs looked at him leave, his figure disappearing on the horizon while the wind whispered his name. They had fulfilled their part, but they knew that Perseus's fate depended on how they used what they had entrusted to him. While moving towards his confrontation with Medusa, the weight of relics in his hands was a reminder constant of faith that nymphs had deposited in him. And although they would not accompany him in the battle, his presence remained, as an echo in his mind, promoting him to be more than a hero, to be worthy of the gifts they had granted him. The sun fell with a soft heat on the island of Ogygia, a corner lost in the vast sea, surrounded by a silence that seemed eternal. There, the beauty of the world reached its cusp. The waters were so crystalline that they reflected the sky as a mirror, and the vegetation grew in a harmony so perfect that it seemed to be the garden of the gods themselves. However, this paradise was impregnated with an inexplicable melancholy, as if every sheet, every stone, silently cried a desire never fulfilled. In the heart of the island, Calypso lived, a superhuman beauty nymph. His hair flowed like golden rivers, and his eyes contained the mystery of the deep ocean. But under that perfection a loneliness inhabited that could not be hidden. She was the daughter of Atlas, the Titan condemned to sustain the heavens, and like him, she was trapped in her own destination, exiled on that island without hope of escape. Despite its isolation, Calypso found comfort in the songs of the wind and the murmur of the waves. He didn't know another home or other love, until he arrived. Odysseus appeared one day, dragged by the furious currents after having lost his crew. His shattered ship and his exonine body were taken to the shore, where Calypso found him. He had never seen a man like him before, but worn by battles, brave, but with the weight of 1,000 tragedies on their shoulders. Without thinking, he took him to his cave, taking care of him with a tenderness he didn't know. When Odysseus woke up, the first thing he saw were Calypso's eyes, shining with a warmth he did not recognize. For days, she fed and healed him, her hands working carefully to restore each wound. He told him about Ithaca, his wife Penelope, and his son Telemachus, who expected his return. Each word was a dagger for Calypso, who realized that, although the man was in front of her, his heart was thousands of kilometers, anchored in his home. The island of Ogygia became a shelter and a prison for Odysseus. Calypso, in love with him, offered what no mortal could reject: immortality. "Stay with me," he said, his soft voice like a whisper in the breeze. "I will give you eternal life. You will never age or know the pain of death." But Odysseus, although tempted by his offer, could not forget Penelope. Her love for her was like a lighthouse in the storm, guiding him to Ithaca despite all obstacles. The days became weeks, and the weeks in years. Calypso and Odysseus shared moments of closeness, laughs under the starry sky, and caresses that seemed to erase the shadows of the past for a moment. However, every night, when Odysseus looked at the horizon, she knew that she could not compete with the memories that kept him captive. The island, which for her was a paradise, was for him a golden cage. Calypso's suffering grew with each dawn. She could not understand how anyone could reject eternity for a mortal love. But deep down, I knew that feelings could not force each other. Thus, when Hermes arrived with Zeus's mandate, ordering Odysseus to flee, his world crumbled. Between tears and resignation, he helped the hero to build a raft, providing it with food and blessings for his trip. The day of the game came, and Odysseus, with a divided heart, said goodbye to Calypso. "Thank you," he said, with a sincerity that crossed her like a sword. She did not respond. He simply watched him while moving away, his figure disappearing slowly on the horizon. When the raft lost sight of, Calypso stayed alone on the shore, the wind playing with his hair while the waves licked his feet. He had done the right thing, even if it hurt in his soul. Ogygia, as beautiful as ever, now seemed more empty than ever. Calypso's story was not just that of a nymph in love, it was that of a silent sacrifice, a love so deep that he preferred the freedom of the other about his own happiness. And so, under the eternal sky of his island, Calypso remained, keeping in his heart the memories of a man who never belonged to him. In the faint dawnlight, when the mist covered the valleys and the echoes of the night they still resonated in the forests, the nymphs danced. Their movements were soft, ethereal, almost imperceptible, as if they were part of the same air they were breathing. It was in those moments, in the heart of silence, where Orpheus found his deepest inspiration. Orpheus, the musician whose talent could bend the will of the gods and calm the beasts, had always felt a special connection with the nymphs. They were not just witnesses of their music, they were his muse and company. The Dryads of the forests, with their hair decorated with leaves and flowers, they listened with devotion every note that arose from the Orpheus lyre. The Naiads, hidden in the streams and lakes, raised their faces from the crystalline waters to be wrapped by the melodies that seemed to slide over the currents. The link between Orpheus and the nymphs was more than mutual admiration. For nymphs, Orpheus was not only a mortal endowed with a divine talent, but a bridge between the human and the sacred. In their songs, they listened to stories of love, loss, and hope that deeply resonated with their own nature. They, eternally young and beautiful, understood the pain of Orpheus, who, despite their genius, carried an unfathomable sadness. When Orpheus lost to Eurydice, his immortal love, the world seemed to stop. His music, before full of life and joy, became a heartbreaking lament that made even the trees cry. The nymphs, who had shared their happiness on luminous days, congregated in the clearings of the forests, feeling the weight of their pain as if it were his. They could not comfort him, there were no words, gestures, or songs that could fill the void left by Eurydice. But they didn't leave him alone either. As guard spirits, they remained close, invisible but present, whispering support in the language of nature. It was thanks to the nymphs that Orpheus gathered the courage to descend to the underworld. The melodies that he composed during that journey were imbued with their essence, of their delicacy and strength. The songs that appeased Coronte and moved Hades had in each note the footprint of the nymphs, who had filled their soul with the purity of nature and the resistance of the elements. When Orpheus returned from Hades, only to lose Eurydice once again, his heart was irreparable. But even then, the nymphs did not abandon him. In the days that followed, he was accompanied while he roamed by mountains and valleys, playing his lyre as if he would desperately seek something he would never find again. The animals went to their call, the rivers altered their course to listen better, and the nymphs, silent and respectful, danced in the shadows, offering comfort with their single presence. The relationship between Orpheus and the nymphs was a testimony of the power of emotional connection. It was not only music or beauty, it was the mutual understanding of souls that shared a link with the eternal. Although Orpheus's fate finally led him to a tragic end, the nymphs continued to sing their songs, whispering their stories to the wind and keeping their memory in every corner of nature. And so, in every melody that springs from the earth, in the whisper of the leaves or the murmur of the water, you can still feel the trace of Orpheus, sustained by the nymphs, who never stopped accompanying it, even beyond time and the loss. In the workshops bathed by the dim light of the torches, where the smell of wet clay was mixed with the heat of the fire, the hands of the Greek artisans shaped figures that would transcend centuries. Among powerful gods, immortal heroes, and epic scenes, nymphs occupied a special place. Its graceful forms and their movements captured in bronze, marble, and ceramics reflected more than their beauty, they were a window to the sacred bond between humans and nature. In Greek sculptures, nymphs were represented as ethereal figures, with delicate bodies and serene faces that transmitted an eternal youth. The marble, cold and rigid, seemed to come alive under the talent of the sculptors, who managed to capture the softness of their skin and the fluidity of their robe in the wind. The dried, guardians of the trees, were carved in elegant poses, with their arms extended as branches and their faces full of a stillness that evoked the forests that inhabited. The Naiads, on the other hand, seemed to arise from the water itself, with hair that fell like waterfalls and feet that barely touched the ground. But not only marble and bronze immortalized nymphs, Greek ceramics, with its reddish and black tones, also told their stories. In the amphory and cratras, the nymphs appeared next to gods and heroes, dancing around Dionysus in a celebration frenzy or accompanying Apollo in times of calm. The artists embodied their figures with simple but expressive lines, making their bodies move with a lightness that seemed to challenge the limitations of the material. In each jug or dish, the nymphs carried with them a fragment of the landscapes they represented, whether dark forests, quiet rivers, or flowered meadows. Greek art not only represented nymphs as symbols of beauty, but also as personifications of human emotions. His expressions varied from pure joy to the melange it smelled, remembering those who contemplated them that, although divine, the nymphs also shared the essence of humanity. A drip dreist with a distant look could evoke the nostalgia of a lost forest, while a naiad with the arms extended to the sky could symbolize the hope that sprouts like the water of a spring. In some cases, the nymphs were not the center of the work, but their presence added an almost magical depth. In reliefs that decorated temples and tombs, they could be seen in the background, dancing between the trees or spying from the shadows. These details, although subtle, remembered the omnipresence of the nymphs in the Greek imaginary, beings that lived not only in nature, but also in the most intimate corners of the human spirit. The Greeks not only admired the nymphs, they venerated them. By capturing them in art, they sought to preserve their essence, immortalize their connection with the landscapes they valued so much. Each sculpture and each painting was an act of devotion, a way of thanking them for the rivers that gave life, the forests that offered refuge, and the fields that supported their crops. But it was also a warning: nymphs, although beautiful and generous, could be relentless with those who did not respect their home. In Greek art, nymphs transcend their mythological role to become a bridge between the earthly and the divine. Through the delicacy of their forms and the depth of their eyes, the artists managed to convey not only their beauty, but also their power and mystery. And although time has eroded many of these works, nymphs continue to dance in marble and ceramics, whispering stories of a world where nature and the sacred were one. Greek literature, loaded with passion and poetry, found an inexhaustible source of inspiration in the nymphs. His verses, fabrics with words that seemed to caress the soul, immortalized these natural deities as figures of incomparable grace and mystery. From Homer's heroic texts to the deep reflections of Hesiod, the nymphs danced throughout the pages as symbols of the sublime, the unattainable, and the divine. Homer, in his Odyssey and the Iliad, could not ignore the presence of nymphs. For him, they were guard spirits that lived in the purest corners of nature. In the Odyssey, the Naiads emerge from the rivers and sources as witnesses of Odysseus's trips, while the Dryads remain in the forests, silent protectors of the eternal. Although they do not occupy the center of their narratives, their presence is constant, as a soft melody that accompanies the feats of the heroes. Homer nymphs are not just part of the landscape, they are the sighs of the wind, the laughter of water, the voice of the earth itself. Hesiod, on the other hand, gives them a more defined place in their theogony. The nymphs appear as daughters of the primary gods, born of the union of Gaia, the earth, and Uranus, the sky. This divine lineage places them among the oldest and venerated beings, giving them a position of respect and power. For Hesiod, the nymphs were not simple guardians of nature, they were living forces that wove the cycles of life and death. Their verses speak of them as eternal, but not immortal, remembering that even the most beautiful in nature is intended to change. Bucolic poets, like Theocritus, also found their muses in the nymphs. In their idyls, nymphs appear as companions of pastors and guardians of flowery meadows. Their stories, impregnated with a soft melancholy, show them as nearby, almost human figures, but always wrapped in a halo of mystery. Theocritus' nymphs are lovers of music and dance, but also solitary, distant beings, whose beauty often leaves mortals in an unattainable state of longing. Pindaro, the master of the Epinicios, was not far behind in his description of the nymphs. In their hymns, they appear as witnesses of the most glorious moments, bathing the heroes in sacred waters before their battles. For Pindaro, the nymphs were not only guardians of nature but also transformation figures, capable of purifying and renewing those who were fortunate to meet them. Beyond the main texts, nymphs live in innumerable fragments and anonymous poems that have reached us as echoes of a distant past. In these works, the nymphs are described as furtive lovers, protective mothers, and, in some cases, fearsome avenger. Their duality, their ability to be both tender and dangerous, makes them figures of a fascinating complexity. In each verse and each line, the Greek poets embodied more than words. They captured the spirit of the nymphs, their indissoluble connection with the natural world, and their ability to evoke in mortals a mixture of asombro and respect. Although their stories vary, the thread that unites them is the feeling that nymphs represent something pure and eternal, something that, although intangible, resides in the depths of nature and human soul. The cults dedicated to the nymphs in ancient Greece were like their own creatures, mysterious, but deeply connected to everyday life and nature itself. They were not Olympic goddesses, but their influence was so present in the Greek soul that it was believed that their sanctuaries and rituals touched the heart of the earth and the human spirit. These minor deities, but no less powerful, were revered in the most green and sections of the known world, where the waters flowed with promises of fertility and the trees whispered old secrets. In the fields, forests and mountains, the sanctuaries dedicated to the nymphs stood without ostentation, but with a palpable sacredness. They did not need elaborate or monumental temples. Its altars were simple, often surrounded by leafy trees, crystalline sources, or gloomy caves. The Greeks sought closeness with them through nature itself, as if the land itself were a reflection of the divine. One of the most emblematic places of the cult of nymphs was Mount Parnassus, considered a place of great spiritual power. There, the nymphs, in particular the dried ones, were revered for their connection with the sacred trees. The mountain was considered Apollo's home and the muses, but also of the nymphs that, with their grace and mystery, inspired poets and artists. In the heart of that place, the devotees made simple sacrifices, fresh flowers, wild fruits, and small animals that represented the purity and the eternal cycle of life. Another famous sanctuary was in Delphi, where nymphs, in their oracle appearance, helped interpret the wishes and questions of mortals. It was not great visions or prophecies, but subtle whispers, such as a fresh breeze after the afternoon, which guided those who asked for advice. The connection with the divinity at this time was so deep that those who approached the temple felt the presence of the nymphs floating in the air, as if they were the voices of wind and water. On the banks of the rivers and in the sources, the Naiades received an equally important cult. It was believed that these water nymphs were guardians of living waters, and those who wanted health and fertility went to their sanctuaries to perform purification ceremonies. Water not only represented life, but also death, and in the Naiades the Greeks saw the connection between these two states. Sacrifices of flowers and libations of wine were offered, while attendees immersed themselves in the waters to seek the blessing of the nymph. The Dryses, the nymphs of the trees, were especially revered in rural areas. His cults were often carried out in small sacred forests, surrounded by oak or oak trees, which symbolized the strength and permanence of nature. These ceremonies were performed with great respect for trees, and offerings were delivered with the hope that the drills would protect the fields and crops. The Greeks, aware of the vital relationship they had with the earth, considered these offerings as a form of reciprocity with nature. Some cities, such as Eleusis, with their famous Demeter cult, also had connections with nymphs, because the fertility and prosperity of the earth were a constant concern. In these places, nymphs were considered intermediaries between the older gods and men. The celebrations in their honor included dances and songs dedicated to them, as if nature itself, personified in their most beautiful forms, responded to the praises of mortals. The Greeks saw nymphs as the personification of natural elements, but also as guardians of the limits between the human and the divine. Thus, their cults and ceremonies were not only carried out in remote places, but they intertwined with everyday life, remembering everyone the constant presence of the sacred in the natural world. The nymphs not only represented the ethereal and the sublime, they were also protective, guides and witnesses of the deepest transformations of humanity. Without them, nature itself would seem empty, stripped of their soul. In the religious life of ancient Greece, nymphs did not have the same status as the great gods of Olympus, but their influence was everywhere. It was believed that, when honoring them, mortals could ensure the protection and blessing of the elements of nature, that invisible force that gave life and that, at the same time, could be destructive. And so, between the nymphs were linked to the muses, the goddesses of the arts, especially to the music muses. It was believed that nymphs had the ability to inspire poets, musicians, and artists, guiding them towards perfection in their creations. In the green meadows and on the edge of the rivers, where the echoes of the flutes and the lizards slid as whispers of the wind, the nymphs were responsible for protecting and promoting the art of music. They were like invisible guardians, their laughs and whispers became melodies, their presence a source of inspiration for artists. One of the most fascinating aspects of the relationship of nymphs with music is the way they manifested in religious ceremonies. In the sanctuaries dedicated to the nymphs, the rituals not only consisted of offerings or dances, but also in music. The Greeks believed that the nymphs sang with the wind and that their voices joined the songs of the animals and the sound of the trees. This natural song was not only a hymn to the beauty of the earth, but also an invitation to mortals to join the cosmos through music. Nymphs were also a reflection of harmony between the human and the divine. In the festivals dedicated to the gods, such as the Dionysia, who celebrated abundance and fertility, nymphs and muses were evoked to fill the air with music and dance. Musicians played lily, flutes, and zitharas, instruments that seemed to resonate with the vibration of the universe, as if the nymphs inhabit the strings of each instrument. The dancers, moving to the beat of these melodies, seemed to enter a trance where their bodies were guided by the nymphs themselves, as if they themselves danced through them. A famous myth speaks of how nymphs, with their delicate beauty and angelic song, were able to captivate even the gods. Apollo, the god of music, had a deep link with the nymphs. He pursued them for forests and mountains, looking for his company to accompany him with his music. It was said that his melody was so captivating that he could make the stars dance in the sky, that the rivers calmed down and that the wind itself stopped on their journey. Thus, the nymphs became the unofficial muses of music, inspiring all those who dared to create harmony through their instruments. In fact, in mythology, the nymph Daphne, in its persecution by Apollo, is associated with music and song. His transformation into laurel not only represents an escape to his destiny, but also a perpetuation of song and melody that, through the ropes of the lyres, were still heard in the wind. Each laurel branch represented a musical note in the eternal symphony of nature. In addition, nymphs were related to different forms of ritual music. The rites in his honor involved special songs and melodies, not only as a tribute, but as a means to communicate with the gods. The hymns sung in their sanctuaries were filled with magic and energy because it was believed that when their names were brought to life their essence. Human voices joined the universe, to the sound of music, becoming a means to play the divine. In the stories of the nymphs, it is often mentioned that their dances were so exquisite that they could take mortals to a state of ecstasy. The nymphs of the mountains and forests, the Dryads, were the ones that were most linked to dance, moving between trees and leaves with such grace that mortals could not help following the rhythm of their movements. Those who watched them felt how their heart was beating the same compass, as if nature itself dictated the tempo. But not only mortals were bewitched by nymph melodies. The gods, always attracted to beauty and harmony, also allowed themselves to rap by the music emanating from them. The festivals in honor of Dionysus, god of wine, music and fun, were full of nymphs that danced, touched instruments and joined the hustle and bustle of the celebration. The followers of Dionysus, in their states of ecstasy induced by wine and music, experienced moments of deep connection with nymphs and muses, joining the human and divine in an endless dance. The music, then, was not only an art in ancient Greece, it was a means to achieve the sacred, and the nymphs, with their eternal link with nature, were the guides that connected mortals with the divine. In the wind melody, in the waters that ran softly, in the creak of the leaves when moving, the nymphs lived, and their influence continued to resonate in each note, in each chord, in each dance that touched the soul. Nymphs were not only guardians of nature, they were also the invisible muses that, in the stillness of the forest or in the rhythm of the river, wove the harmony of the world. Nymphs, creatures whose essence is between nature and the divine, were not only seen as beauty and grace figures. In ancient Greece, his presence also carried a deep symbolism of wisdom and reflection. Although they were often associated with fertility, youth, and wildlife, their role in mythology went beyond the simple image of the jovial goddess that inhabited the corners of forests and rivers. Nymphs, in their intrinsic connection with natural elements, were considered sources of philosophical inspiration, a reflection of the secrets of the universe. There was something mystical in them, a silent serenity that made them figures of respect, almost as teachers of the hidden mysteries of nature. They were not only beautiful, but wise, with a knowledge that seemed to arise from the same earth and water, as deep and ancient as the world itself. The nymphs were the whispers of the trees, the murmur of the waters, the dance of the wind. They represented perfection in their purest form, a wisdom that did not come from words, but of the harmony of nature. Greek philosophy, focused on the search for truth and knowledge, found in the nymphs a living metaphor of the ideals of balance and wisdom. In their domains, either in forests, rivers, or mountains, nymphs embodied the perfection of the cosmos. Its very existence was a reminder that everything in the universe has a purpose, that every being, however small or ethereal, plays a crucial role in the great fabric of life. Nature, represented by them, was the largest school for those who wanted to achieve true wisdom. Often, Greek philosophers, observing nature, found lessons that transcended the mere reason. Nymphs, as guardians of natural forces, seemed to live in a world without a hurry, a world where time was not measured by hours, but by the cycles of life. Eternity was not an abstract issue, but something tangible, reflected in its immortal existence. This wisdom of nymphs was a way of living in harmony with the world, a lesson that invited mortals to abandon the constant struggle with destiny and accept the fluidity of life. Nymphs, in their various forms, were also linked to the knowledge that transcended mortality. The Dryad, guardians of the trees, represented the ancestral knowledge of the roots of the earth, a wisdom that flowed through the veins of Mother Nature. The Naiads, on the other hand, were responsible for protecting deep waters, seas, and oceans, and their wisdom resided in the secrets hidden under the waves, in the navigation mysteries, and the fate of travelers. All this reflected a deep understanding of the balance between the visible and the invisible, between the known and the unknown. It was believed that nymphs possessed intuitive knowledge, a wisdom transmitted not through formal books or teachings, but through experience, observation, and connection with the natural. The waters that played with their fingers brought visions of the deep, the winds that caressed their skin whispered secrets of the universe. For those who were wise enough to listen and observe, the nymphs offered lessons that could not be taught in the academies of Athens. The nature itself was his book, and every sheet, every rock, each current of water was a page that revealed the meaning of existence. The myths say that, on some occasions, the nymphs provided wisdom to the heroes, guiding them in their search for knowledge or helping them to understand the secrets that only the gods knew. In his gaze, sometimes calm, sometimes intense, there was an understanding that overflowed time and space. Often, when the heroes, lost or confused, they approached them in search of answers, the nymphs did not offer them direct advice, but presented them the mystery as an enigma to solve for themselves. Thus, they taught them the importance of the inner trip, of reflection, to listen to their own being. The form of wisdom offered by the nymphs was not rigid or academic, it was organic, adapted to life itself. It was not an absolute truth, but about fluid understanding that was manifested through nature, through the deep connection with the earth, the sea, and the sky. Nymphs did not speak like philosophers, but their presence was enough to transmit the lessons that would otherwise be unattainable. In landscapes painted by poets, nymphs are more than just enigmatic figures, they are symbols of the philosophical principles that thinkers try to understand. The harmony of their movements, the freedom of its existence, represented a life lived in accordance with nature itself. In this sense, nymphs were teachers of practical philosophy, teach to live in balance with the world, accept impermanence, and understand that, although human beings are ephemeral, nature is eternal. Therefore, nymphs were not only guardians of natural elements, but also the depositories of primordial wisdom. The philosophers, when observing them, learned that true knowledge does not lie in the answers, but in the questions, in the understanding that the search for wisdom is never linear, but that it occurs spiral, such as the cycles of life that nymphs personify. In their beauty, in their transience, in their connection with everything that surrounds them, the nymphs show us that true wisdom is not to dominate the world, but to understand our place in it. Nymphs, ethereal guardians of natural landscapes, not only existed as figures of beauty, wisdom and protection, but also played an essential role in the genesis of the world in Greek mythology. Throughout the founding stories that from the beginning of the times, when chaos reigned and the elementary forces had not yet balanced, the nymphs were presented as beings born of the same primitive essence that shapes the universe. They were not creative divinities such as the Olympic gods, but they were intrinsically linked to the fundamental principles that allowed the world to charge form. Its existence, then, was not accidental. The nymphs were manifestations of the very force of creation, carrying within themselves the ability to give life and transformation. In some myths, such as the creation of trees and rivers, nymphs were not only witnesses to the awakening of nature, but direct actors in their configuration. The stories suggest that, at first, the earth was a vast empty extension, full of chaos. And it was the nymphs responsible for personifying and materializing the natural elements that the world would later inhabit. With their essence linked to trees, mountains, waters, and air, nymphs were responsible for planting the seeds that would give rise to life. The relationship of nymphs with the elements of nature is, in itself, a representation of the first steps of creation. Not only did they help populate the earth symbolically, but they were also essential for nature forces to balance and cosmic forces could move towards their full development. Nymphs were associated with the fertility of the earth, the purity of the waters, the growth of forests, and the protection of the mountains. Without them, the creation cycle would have been incomplete. This link between nymphs and elements not only reflects the natural order, but also highlights the deep connection of the first divinities with life itself. The nymphs were not created to dominate the earth, but to preserve it, take care of it and nurture it. Through their care, forests grew leafy, rivers flowed alive, and the mountains stood majestic, such as the fundamental structures that supported the balance of the world. It was the nymphs who, when sowing the seeds on earth, guaranteed the perpetuation of life itself. In the story of the creation of humans, nymphs also have their place. In some versions of myths, it is mentioned that the nymphs were responsible for creating harmony between gods and mortals, acting as intermediaries between the two worlds. Nymphs shared their wisdom and goodness, but also offered their favors, falling in love with mortals and giving them gifts and blessings. In this sense, the nymphs helped to cement the relationship between man and the gods, acting as the benevolent figures that provided the connection with the divine. One of the most representative stories in which nymphs play a crucial role is the myth of the creation of stations. According to some myths, the seasons of the year were an invention of the nymphs, whose changes of their presence and activities with the stations directly influence the cycles of nature. Spring, with its flowers and new outbreaks, was linked to the nymphs of the gardens and fields, while the fall was associated with the nymphs that inhabited forests and fruit trees. Winter, cold and austere, brought with it the stillness of the mountains, while the summer, warm and vibrant, was governed by the nymphs that danced in the golden fields by the sun. Thus, the nymphs not only took care of creation, but actively participated in the organization of natural cycles. But beyond their influence on nature and life, nymphs also played an essential role in the formation of cultural traditions. Through their stories, the deep connection between humans and the natural world was perpetuated, a connection that the ancient Greeks considered sacred. The nymphs, being immortal and natural figures, represented that part of humanity that was still connected to the divine and the primary. In their stories, ancient beliefs about the origin of the life and purpose of humanity were reflected. His role in the myths of creation also reflected the idea that cosmos and nature were not static entities, but were constantly evolving, fed by the same energies that gave life to human beings and gods. The nymphs were the bond between the forces of nature and the Olympic gods, who ruled the universe with power and authority. While the gods represented divine control, nymphs personified the fluidity and transformation of life itself. The myths of creation, by putting nymphs as fundamental forces in the process of structuring the world, remind us that creation is not only an act of divine will, but a manifestation of harmonious interaction between the gods, nature, and human beings. The nymphs, with their silent but powerful presence, were the ones that really wove the tapestry of life, guiding the training process and ensuring that everything created was preserved with love and devotion. In ancient Rome, the nymphs were figures that transcended the limits of Greek mythology to adapt and take new forms within Roman culture. Although the nymphs already existed in the Greek tradition, the Romans adopted them and turned them into an essential part of their own belief pantheon. The way they saw and represented them had their nuances, adapting the stories and characteristics of the nymphs to better integrate them into their own values and beliefs about nature, spirituality, and protection. Roman nymphs, such as their Greek counterparts, were female beings linked to various aspects of nature. However, while in Greece the nymphs were mainly seen as beings that embodied natural elements, in Rome they acquired an even deeper dimension of protection and spiritual guardians of natural spaces. The Romans tended to see the nymphs not only as beautiful deities of nature, but also as entities that were part of the harmony that should be maintained among humans and the natural world. In this sense, the nymphs were not only a representation of the wild or the main. One of the most important differences that the Romans made in the vision of the nymphs was their association with the idea of noumen, a key concept in Roman religion. The Romans believed in the existence of divine forces, or spirits, that inhabited objects, places, and elements of nature. These forces not only represented divine power, but also protected and maintained the balance of life. In this sense, Roman nymphs could be seen as manifestations of these noumen, and their function in Roman daily life was closely related to the protection of fields, households, and cities. The nymphs were associated especially with watercourses, trees, and mountains. In particular, the rivers and sources nymphs, such as Naiads, were very revered in Rome. It was believed that they ruled the waters and guaranteed the purity and fertility of rivers, lagoons, and sources, all essential elements for Roman agriculture. The waters were the livelihood of life and wealth in Rome, and the nymphs were seen as those in charge of ensuring the constant flow of the waters and ensuring that the crops were abundant. The Druids, on the other hand, the nymphs of the trees, especially of the oaks and the poplars, also played a crucial role in the mythal Roman ogia. In Rome, the trees were considered sacred, and many of them were connected to the gods and the foundational legends of the city. The different, therefore, were not only responsible for the well-being of the forests, but also represented the eternal life of nature. In ancient Rome, trees were symbols of strength, longevity, and fertility, and the nymphs associated with them were considered protective of the vitality and growth of the earth. A prominent example of the Roman adaptation of the nymphs is the figure of Pomona, the Roman goddess of the orchards and the gardens. Although it was not exactly a nymph, its role as a guardian of fruit trees and crops was closely related to the functions of nymphs in Greek mythology. Pomona, as a protective goddess of the gardens, is considered a representation of the nymphs of the orchards and fields, responsible for ensuring that nature will provide everything necessary for the support of humans. His relationship with the Vertumno god, a god of stations and transformation, also underlines the connection between nymphs and the cycle of life and renewal in the natural world. The Romans also integrated the nymphs into their religious celebrations and rites, especially in those who were linked to agriculture and the protection of nature. During the festivities, the nymphs were honored through offerings and rituals that sought to ensure that the stations followed their appropriate course and that the fertility of the earth was maintained. In the gardens of Rome, small altars dedicated to these divinities were erected, where people offered flowers, fruits, and other products of the earth to honor the nymphs that had made them possible. Roman art, like Greek, portrayed nymphs in a way that reflected their connection with natural beauty. The Roman fresh and sculptures showed the nymphs in a variety of scenes, either dancing in the forests, swimming in the waters, or participating in festivals with the gods. These artistic representations reflected the idea of nymphs as beings that personified grace, youth, and harmony with nature, qualities that the Romans venerated deeply. In Roman literature, nymphs were also figures that inspired poets and writers. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, is one of the authors that most clearly adapted and transformed the myths of Greek nymphs, giving a Roman turn to the love and tragedy stories that surrounded these divinities. Ovid nymphs are often melancholic characters that symbolize the transience of beauty and youth, but also reflect the intrinsic relationship of the Romans with nature as an eternal cycle of life and renewal. In summary, the nymphs in ancient Rome were much more than simple adaptations of the Greek figures. They represented the vital force of nature, were protective of the essential elements for human life and, through their interaction with the Roman gods, became symbols of harmony and the balance between the human and the divine. In their adaptability, the Roman nymphs offered a reflection of the deep respect that the Romans had for the earth, the natural elements, and the uninterrupted cycle of life. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the nymphs experienced a significant transformation in their representation and role within art and literature. While in classical antiquity the nymphs were figures linked to nature and the gods, in these periods, their figure was nuanced with Christian, romantic and humanistic influences, adapting to the new visions of the world. The connection with the divine, nature and beauty lasted, but the way they were represented and understood varied considerably. During the Middle Ages, the approach in the divine and the supernatural dominated many areas of life, and the Christian religion was the center of thought. The vision of the world was framed by belief in a spiritual reality far beyond the earthly. In this context, the nymphs of classical mythology were reinterpreted and, in many cases, absorbed or displaced by Christian figures. 1. The decline of classic nymphs, as the ancient Greeks and Romans knew them, began to be seen with skepticism. During the Middle Ages, beliefs in the gods of the classic pantheon lost their central place, replaced by Christianity. In this sense, nymphs, as figures associated with natural elements and paganism, were mostly displaced from religious narratives. However, its beauty characteristics, eternal youth and connection with nature endured in a more softened and spiritual version. 2. The replacement for spirits and angels. Instead of being venerated as divine figures of nature, nymphs were greatly replaced by elementary spirits and angels that maintained a closer relationship with the Christian faith. For example, fairies, spiritual and magical creatures associated with nature, took the place of nymphs in many medieval traditions. Often, fairies were considered messengers or servants of divinity, instead of autonomous beings, such as nymphs. 3. Symbolism of nature. Despite its displacement, nymphs, as guardians of forests, rivers, and mountains, continued to represent the mystical connection between the human and nature. In medieval painting, for example, natural landscapes, often populated by female figures that could remind nymphs, were used to represent the beauty of divine creation. Nature, in this context, was a reflection of the magnificence of God. The Renaissance, with its resurgence of interest in classical culture, brought with it a rebirth of ancient mythologies, including nymph figures. This period was characterized by a return to the study of the ancient Greek and Roman texts, which allowed a richer and more complex reinterpretation of the mythological figures. The nymphs were one of the figures that recovered their relevance, but with a significant turn. 1. The rebirth of nymphs as symbols of beauty and nature. During the Renaissance, artists and poets began to see nymphs as symbols of idealized beauty and the connection between humanity and nature. They were seen as beings of grace and splendor who represented perfection in nature. Artists, influenced by classical mythology, began to portray nymphs in natural exuberant scenes, often accompanied by mythological gods or heroes. These representations were a way of idealizing both female beauty and harmony between human beings and the natural environment. 2. The nymphs in Renaissance art. The Renaissance produced a series of works that highlighted the nymphs, mainly in painting and sculpture. Renaissance artists, such as Sandro Botticelli with their famous work La Primavera, recreated mythological scenes in which the nymphs played an outstanding role. In this work, for example, nymphs, represented as ethereal and light figures, accompany the mythological figures of Flora and Venus, emulating the grace and beauty of nature that arises in spring. Titian, another prominent Renaissance, also painted nymphs, often as sensual and female figures, as in his famous Diana and Actaeon. In these representations, the nymphs were linked to the most human and earthly aspects of beauty and nature, while the largest mythological figures, such as Apollo or Jupiter, occupied a central place in the compositions. Often, the nymphs were shown in moments of interaction with gods or mortals, which reflected their role of intermediaries between the divine and the human. 3. The nymphs in Renaissance literature. Renaissance poetry also regained interest in nymphs. Poets like Petrarca and Tasso integrated these figures in their writings, treating nymphs as unattainable beauty symbols and idealized nature. In their poems, nymphs not only personified the forces of nature, but also love, desire and transformation. In addition, the presence of nymphs in Renaissance poetry symbolized the attraction of the divine towards the human and the spiritual connection with the natural world. 4. Humanization of nymphs. Unlike their most distant representation in ancient times, during the Renaissance the nymphs acquired a more human dimension. Renaissance artists not only represented them as celestial beings, but also endowed with complex emotional and psychological qualities. Often, nymphs were shown with more human features, reflecting the rediscovery of the importance of individuality and emotional expression that characterized Renaissance culture. In summary, the nymphs in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance went from being figures associated with paganism and nature to become symbols of idealized beauty and the connection between the human and the divine. While in the Middle Ages they were largely displaced by the Christian figure of Los Angeles and the spirits, in the Renaissance they resurfaced with a new interpretation, becoming representations of grace, beauty, and natural perfection. Thus, nymphs, as timeless beings of mythology, adapted to cultural and artistic changes, playing an important role in the evolution of human vision about nature and divine. Chapter 3.3 Nymphs in Modern Literature. The figure of the nymphs has maintained its influence and relevance in modern literature, from the 19th century to the present. Although nymphs are no longer seen as goddesses of nature with the same degree of devotion as in ancient times, their symbolism and attractiveness last through various literary interpretations. In this chapter, we will explore how nymphs have been represented and reimagined in modern literature, as well as their role in the development of issues such as nature, beauty, desire, and the supernatural. During the 19th century, the Renaissance and the Industrial Revolution brought with them a deeper reflection on the relationship of the human being with nature. The writers of Romanticism were particularly influenced by mythological figures, such as nymphs, which represented a spiritual and primitive connection with the natural world. At this time, the nymphs were seen as symbols of the unattainable and the mysterious, characteristics of an era that direct contact with nature was being lost due to the advancement of urbanization. 1. Romanticism, mysticism and nature. Romantic writers such as William Blake and Lord Byron were inspired by the figure of nymphs as guardians of a natural world that was disappearing. In his works, nymphs were represented not only as creatures of ethereal beauty, but also as symbols of purity and the power of wild nature. In Childe Harold's Pilgrimage by Byron, the relationship between man and nature is often described so that nymphs, as natural beings, embody the harmony of a pre-industrial world. 2. The symbolism, connection with the supernatural. The symbolist writers of the late 19th century, such as Charles Baudelaire and Stéphane Mallarmé, took elements of classical mythology and transformed them into symbols of unattainable desires and existential anguish. In their writings, the nymphs became representations of the hidden, the intangible, and the desired. These authors explored nymphs as beauty figures that, despite their captivating power, remained in a dimension beyond human reach, evoking the frustration of the human being by trying to access the divine and the perfect. The 20th century brought with it a more experimental and avant-garde approach in literature, with authors who moved away from classical conventions and entered new ways of thinking about mythology and nature. In this era of rapid changes, nymphs continued to be a powerful metaphor, but their representation began to move away from romantic conceptions, acquiring new meanings. 1. Modernism, fragmentation and crisis of nature. Modernist authors, such as T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf, took the mythological figures, including nymphs, to explore the fragmentation of the individual and the identity crisis. In works such as The Bald Ear of Eliot, nymphs can be seen as symbols of decline and alienation. Nature and supernatural are no longer seen as an idealized refuge, but as a distant and even disturbing presence that reflects the disconnection of modern humanity with its natural environment. 2. Surrealism, transformation and liberation. In surreal literature, the nymphs reinterpreted as figures that challenged the norms of reality and moved between the tangible and the dream world. Writers such as André Breton and Salvador Dalí used nymphs as representations of mystical femininity and uncontrollable desire. Nymphs became figures that, like dreams and hallucinations, had the power to transform reality and explore the limits between the conscious and the subconscious. In this literature, nymphs are images of the unusual, which open new ways of thinking and perceiving reality. Today, nymphs remain fascinating figures in modern literature, but their interpretation has evolved and has adapted to new cultural and social forms. They are no longer only mythological figures of a distant past, but characters that are used to explore issues of feminism, ecology, and the supernatural in a contemporary context. In addition, popular culture, especially in fantastic and science fiction literature, has integrated nymphs into new stories and contexts. 1. Feminism and female empowerment. In contemporary literature, nymphs have been reimagined as symbols of female power and autonomy. Often, nymphs are no longer mere passive figures of beauty or desire, but active characters that defend their own interests and challenge social norms. Contemporary authors such as Margaret Atwood in The Story of the Maid, or Madeline Miller in Circe, have reinterpreted mythological figures such as the Nymphs to explore issues of power, rebellion, and female freedom. Nymphs, in this context, are more than magical beings, they are characters that embody the struggle for self-determination and identity. 2. Ecology and nature. In an era of increasing ecological awareness, nymphs have also been taken as symbols of the relationship between human beings and the environment. Contemporary authors such as Terry Tempest Williams in their work Refugio have used figures such as nymphs to talk about the spiritual and emotional connection that people can have with nature, as well as the responsibility of protecting it. In these works, nymphs represent both the delicate balance of ecosystems and the resistance of nature against human threats. 3. Fantastic literature and popular culture. In fantastic literature and in imaginary worlds, nymphs continue to be key characters. From J.R.R. Tolkien and its elves, influenced by classic nymphs, to fairies and magical creatures in the novels of J.K. Rowling, nymphs continue to play an essential role. In this context, nymphs are presented as mysterious and powerful beings, capable of transforming reality or challenging the laws of the universe. In modern literature, nymphs have gone through a series of transformations, adapting to new social, cultural, and ecological concerns. While in the previous centuries the nymphs were mainly beauty and desire figures, today they are given a broader range of meanings, including female empowerment, connection with nature, and exploration of the supernatural. Through the ages, nymphs continue to be a powerful metaphor, representing the mystery of nature, femininity, and desire, as well as the challenges of the human being in their relationship with the natural world and the divine. Nymphs, as mythical figures deeply connected to nature, beauty, and supernatural, have had a considerable influence on contemporary cinema and television. Its representation has evolved based on the cultural transformations and narrative trends of each era. From the first adaptations of mythology in the cinema to the complex modern reinterpretations, the nymphs have been a fascinating means to explore issues such as femininity, natural power, and the struggle between the divine and the human. In this chapter, we will examine how nymphs have been adapted and reinterpreted in film and television productions. From the first days of cinema, the adaptations of Greek and Roman myths were popular, especially during the Golden Age of Hollywood. However, the nymphs were, in general, figures that adapted less than other more prominent myths such as Zeus, Hercules, or Perseus. Despite this, some films used nymphs as symbols of the supernatural, ethereal beauty, or as guardians of nature. 1. Classical mythology films. In the 1950s and 1960s, when the epic cinema about Greek mythology was in its boom, films such as Jason and Argonautas, 1963, or Fury of Titans, 1981, took elements of mythology to create adventures full of fantastic creatures. Although the nymphs were not the central characters, they were represented as part of a magical world full of gods, monsters, and heroes. The nymphs, in these productions, were usually beautiful, mysterious, and, often, served as ethereal presences to provide help to the heroes or provide wisdom. 2. Fantastic and supernatural adventure fantasy films, such as Princess Mononoke, 1997, of Studio Ghibli, present characters inspired by nymphs, although not always directly. In this work, the spirits of nature, although they are not exactly nymphs in the classical sense, fulfill a similar role, acting as representations of nature itself, often with the ability to heal or destroy depending on the human being's relationship with the environment. The film offers a reflection on the interaction between human beings and nature, similar to the function of nymphs in the original myths. As television became the most popular entertainment medium in the 21st century, mythological figures, including nymphs, began to gain prominence in various fantasy and science fiction series. The nymphs were reimagined, and their role was expanded, integrating not only as beauty or desire figures, but also as powerful forces of nature or even complex characters with internal dilemmas. 1. Xena, the Warrior Princess, 1995 to 2001. In this television series, which was based largely on Greek mythology, the nymphs were represented as an integral part of the adventures of Xena and her friend Gabrielle. Although the nymphs were not the main characters, their appearance as mysterious creatures that helped the heroes, guided in battles, or, in some cases, challenged the protagonists, reflected the complex nature of the nymphs of mythology. In this sense, the nymphs were shown as allies, but also as unpredictable beings, which could have a dark or dangerous side, depending on the situation. 2. Hercules, Legendary Trips, 1995 to 1999, as in Xena. In this series of adventures based on Greek mythology, nymphs were introduced as secondary characters. They often served as divine beings that granted powers or advice to Hercules in their heroic tasks. Nymphs, such as forest or water creatures, were treated as wise and mysterious, always associated with the magical, the sacred and the unattainable. In recent years, nymphs have experienced a rebirth in cinema and television, especially in productions that explore the fantastic, the supernatural and the mythological. Modern nymphs have reimagined in various ways, adapting to current times and responding to contemporary issues, such as ecology, feminism, and struggles between man and nature. 1. Percy Jackson and the Gods of Olympus, 2010. This series of films based on Rick Riordan's books revitalized classical mythology for a youth audience, including the presence of nymphs and other mythological creatures. In Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, nymphs appear in the form of magical and ethereal beings, who attend young heroes on their journey to defeat the gods and save the world. Although the nymphs in this series are not necessarily central figures, they are still symbols of the connection with the divine and the natural. 2. La Cueva, 2019. This adventure and terror thriller explores relations between human beings and nature through the figure of mysterious creatures that live in the depths of a cave system. Although they are not explicitly named as nymphs, the creatures that inhabit in the dark are clear references to natural beings, endowed with a symbiotic relationship with their underground environment. Through this story, nymph mythology is modernized to explore tensions between humanity and nature. 3. Game of Thrones, 2011 to 2019, in this popular series based on the books of George R.R. Martin, the nymphs and creatures inspired by them make appearances in various forms, although not always explicitly. The goddesses or entities that inhabit the forest, such as those that accompany the characters on their trips, are strongly influenced by the classical representations of the nymphs. In addition, the series presents a rich mysterious female figures, often represented as supernatural forces that exert influence on the destinations of the characters. Nymphs have also influenced popular culture more generally, not only in cinema and television, but also in video games, literature and music. In fantasy video games, such as The Witcher or Final Fantasy, nymphs appear as powerful, often allied or enemies, with magical abilities related to water, trees, or nature. In music, bands like Florence and the Machine and Lana Del Rey have used images of nymphs to evoke themes of beauty, desire, and the supernatural in their video clips and lyrics. Nymphs have maintained a significant presence in modern cinema and television, being reinterpreted in various ways to reflect the values and concerns of each era. Although the representations of the nymphs have changed, their symbolism as figures of beauty, natural power, and mystery has endured, making them cultural symbols that continue to influence contemporary narrative. At present, nymphs continue to be a fascinating figure, capable of transcending the limits of mythology to become powerful metaphors of the divine, the feminine, and the supernatural. The figure of the nymphs, originating in Greek mythology, has endured over the centuries as a symbol of beauty, nature, and the supernatural. Although their representation has evolved from ancient Greece, nymphs remain a source of inspiration for contemporary artists. In current painting and sculpture, nymphs are reinterpreted through new perspectives, adapting to the aesthetic, social, and philosophical concerns of our time. This chapter explores how nymphs have been represented and transformed into contemporary art, revealing their changing meanings in a modern context. In the transition between classical and modern art, mythology continued to be a significant source of inspiration, although with a more subjective and symbolist approach. During the Renaissance, artists such as Sandro Botticelli and Raphael continued to represent the nymphs according to the traditions of Greek mythology, but in the 19th and 20th century, with the advent of artistic movements such as Romanticism, Symbolism and Impressionism, the artists began to reinterpret the mythological figures, stripping them of their formal rigidity to accommodate a greater emotional and sensory expression. 1. Romanticism and symbolism. Romantic artists such as Eugene Delacroix and symbolists such as Gustave Moreau used the figure of nymphs as symbols of indomitable nature and intense emotions. The nymphs were no longer only figures of physical beauty, but representations of the mysterious, the unattainable and the fearsome, which reflected the struggle between the individual and the forces of nature. 2. Impressionism and modern art. In Impressionism, artists such as Claude Monet and Pierre-Auguste Renoir did not directly represent the nymphs, but their work with light, color, and atmosphere captured the ethereal and sublime essence of these mythological beings. The landscape, nature, and emotional connection with the natural world became a predominant theme, rescuing the idea of nymphs as spirits of nature. As we move around the 20th and 21st century, nymphs have reinvented themselves in contemporary art, not only as mythological beings, but as powerful metaphors of issues such as feminism, ecology, and identity. Contemporary artists have begun to explore nymphs not only in their traditional role of nature protectors, but also as multidimensional characters, which cover the sacred, the profane, the sublime, and the dangerous. 1. Nymphomania and female sexuality. In the contemporary context, nymphs have been reinterpreted as symbols of female sexuality, freedom, and desire. The figure of the nymph has often associated with transgression, as in the case of Jeff Koons' work, who, in his series Gazing Ball, presents mythological and classical figures, including nymphs, to reflect on desire, femininity, and the idealized figure in popular culture and art. Here, nymphs are no longer only beings of pure beauty and without guilt, but complex characters that explore the limits between innocence and sensuality. 2. Nymphs and ecology. The relationship of nymphs with nature has been reinterpreted in a more ecological and environmental context. Contemporary artists such as Olafur Eliasson or Agnes Mayabondis have explored the connection between humans and the environment through the figure of the nymph, which symbolizes the vitality and protection of the natural world. In work such as Eliasson's, which often incorporate natural elements such as water and light, nymphs are transformed into symbols of power and fragility of nature. Its representation today becomes a reminder of the symbiotic relationship between human beings and the natural world, as well as the dangers inherent to their exploitation. 3. The portrait of the nymph as being vulnerable. In the context of contemporary identity, some representations of nymphs explore their vulnerability, making them symbols of human fragility in an increasingly denatured world. Artists such as Frida Kahlo or Louise Bourgeois have created works that explore pain, suffering, and transformation, themes also present in the myths of the nymphs. The representations of the nymphs, often associated with eternal youth and perfect beauty, are transformed into images of the inevitable decline, of the contradiction between apparent perfection and vulnerability inherent in the human being. In the field of contemporary sculpture, nymphs remain a source of inspiration, often reinterpreted with a modern approach. Contemporary nymph sculptures have tended to move away from classical representations, taking into account three-dimensionality and space in a more abstract and conceptual way. 1. The sculpture and nature. The contemporary artist Andy Goldsworthy, known for his work with natural elements, has created facilities in which nymphs could be seen as an implicit presence in the interaction of natural elements with human intervention. Using wood, stone, leaves and other organic materials, their sculptures evoke the connection of nymphs with the earth, flora, and fauna. Although nymphs are not directly represented in their works, interaction with the nature and fragility of its existence resonates strongly with the classic nymph symbolism. 2. Abstract reinterpretations of nymphs. Contemporary sculptors like Jeff Koons and Kiki Smith have reinterpreted the mythological figures, including nymphs, in abstract and surreal ways. These reinterpretations play with the human body, the symbols of nature, and the organic, using materials such as bronze, glass, and metal to create more distant representations of the classic figure. In Smith's work, for example, female figures are often related to the wild, the natural, and the supernatural, creating a hybrid figure between the human and the divine. Nymphs, as mythological figures deeply connected to nature, beauty, and transformation, remain a fascinating source of inspiration in contemporary art. From their first representations in classical sculpture to modern reinterpretations that explore issues such as femininity, ecology, and identity, nymphs continue to be a powerful and adaptable symbol in human creativity. As contemporary artists continue to explore the limits between the natural and the supernatural, the nymphs remain as an eternal reflection of our relationship with the world around us. Over the centuries, the nymphs have been mythological figures that have transcended the time, adapting to the values and beliefs of each era. From its beginnings as guardians of the natural elements in ancient Greece, to their reinterpretations in contemporary art and culture, nymphs have maintained significant symbolic power. At present, nymphs remain a source of inspiration and a reflection of our connection with nature, mystery, and divine. This chapter explores the legacy of nymphs in the modern world and its symbolism in the current context. In the modern world, nymphs continue to be powerful symbols of nature and the deep connection between human beings and the environment. In an era where concern about ecological crisis and sustainability is increasingly urgent, nymphs have become an emblem of the need to preserve and protect nature. In this sense, nymphs represent the harmony between the human and the natural, reminding us of the importance of living in balance with our environment. 1. The rebirth of environmentalism and nymphs. With the rise of environmental movements and the growing concern for climate change, nymphs have been reinterpreted as protectors of the earth, oceans, forests, and rivers. Many environmental awareness campaigns resort to these mythological figures to symbolize the fragility of ecosystems and the urgent need for their conservation. Nymphs, with their ancestral link with natural elements, have become powerful metaphors of the earth itself, demanding respect and care. 2. The resurgence of mythology in popular culture. In contemporary cinema, television, and literature, nymphs have experienced a resurgence, adopting modern forms and being presented as mystical and protective figures of nature. In films and series such as The Lord of the Rings, Avatar, or The Twilight Saga, similar nymphs or beings perform roles on guardians of forests, seas, and other natural forces. This presence of nymphs in popular culture not only keeps mythology alive, but also reinforces the symbolic relationship of humans with the natural world, remembering the importance of respecting and living in harmony with the planet. At present, nymphs have also become powerful symbols of feminism and female autonomy. In Greek mythology, nymphs were represented as independent female beings that, although in many cases they were linked to a male deity, had a deep connection with the nature and power it grants. In this context, nymphs can be seen as representatives of female force, beauty, and freedom. 1. The nymphs as symbols of femininity. Within the framework of the struggle for women's rights and the revaluation of femininity, nymphs have been reinterpreted as emblems of independence and feminine power. Through the decades, there has been greater visibility to the female figures that, such as nymphs, represent the connection between women and earth, fertility, and creation. Thus, nymphs can also be seen as metaphors of women fighting for claiming their place in society and their right to be recognized for their independence, wisdom, and strength. 2. Reinterpretation in contemporary art and culture. Contemporary artists and writers have used the figure of nymph as a representation of modern women who defy traditional expectations. In the works of feminist authors and visual artists, the nymphs are often represented as complex and multifaceted figures that, instead of being mere objects of beauty, are presented as figures that have a deep wisdom, an instinctive connection with nature, and an inherent power that makes them symbols of resistance and autonomy. In addition to their symbolism in nature and feminism, nymphs continue to play a role in the field of mysticism and the spiritual today. In an increasingly technological and materialistic world, the connection with the mystical and the spiritual has resurfaced in many ways, and the nymphs, with their association to the supernatural, unattainable beauty, and the connection with the divine, have maintained their presence in spiritual stories and modern esoteric practices. 1. The rebirth of the spirituality of nature. Nymphs, such as mystical and supernatural figures, are associated with spiritual rituals and practices that celebrate the connection with the earth. At present, many spiritual and ecological movements resort to the figure of the nymph as a representative of the connection with the natural elements and the transformative power of nature. The idea of nymphs as intermediaries between the human and the divine resonates in practices such as shamanism and other philosophies oriented to respect for the environment and the connection with the transcendental. 2. The use of nymphs in esoteric art. In painting, sculpture, and contemporary esoteric literature, nymphs remain represented as beings with a deep connection with the divine and the immaterial. His image appears frequently in works of art that explore mysticism, the spiritual, and the hidden. Esoteric artists use them as symbols of the invisible powers that govern the universe and the need to understand the intangible to access ancestral wisdom. The legacy of nymphs endures the modern world as a testimony of the eternal connection between human being and nature, femininity, mystical and divine. Since its origin in Greek mythology, they have been represented in innumerable forms and have played a fundamental role in myths, art, and culture. Today, nymphs remain a source of inspiration for artists, activists, and thinkers, and their symbolism continues to offer a deep vision about the human relationship with the natural world and the transcendental. Its ability to adapt and evolve over time has made nymphs a timeless figure, whose influence is still alive in contemporary culture, reminding us of the importance of beauty, respect for nature, and the need for a deeper connection with the mysteries of the world. Nymphs, as mythological figures, have left a deep brand in different cultures and historical periods. From its appearance in ancient Greece to its presence in modern art, literature, and popular culture, nymphs have been a constant source of inspiration. This chapter offers a summary of the cultural impact of nymphs throughout history, exploring how they have influenced mythology, art, literature, religion, and society throughout the centuries. In ancient Greece, nymphs were key figures in mythology, representing natural elements and playing an essential role in the stories of the gods and heroes. They were seen as guardians of the rivers, forests, mountains, and other fundamental parts of the natural world. His role as protective and sometimes seductive beings made complex figures that influence both religion and the daily life of the Greeks. 1. Natural and divine symbolism. Nymphs were considered intermediaries between humans and divine forces. Their connection with the elements of nature made them symbols of the eternal cycle of life and death, fertility and preservation. In the Greek religion, many temples and sanctuaries were dedicated to nymphs, highlighting their importance in the spiritual and cultural life of the time. 2. The relationship with the Olympic gods. Often, the nymphs had a role in the myths that involved Olympic gods such as Zeus, Apollo, and Artemis. His influence on Greek mythology was deep, since they were not only participants in the great stories of creation and divine struggle, but were also venerated by their beauty, wisdom, and power over the natural world. When Greek mythology was adopted by Rome, the nymphs were integrated into the Roman pantheon, although sometimes with differences in their representation. In Rome, nymphs acquired a greater symbolic dimension related to fertility and home protection. 1. Nymph cults. During ancient Rome, nymphs continued to be venerated figures, but their cult focused mainly on domestic life and family protection. The Romans associated the nymphs with the protective forces of the home and the field, and in some cases, the nymphs were seen as deities that watched for the well-being of women and children. 2. Representation in Roman art. In Roman art, nymphs were represented in sculptures, fresh and mosaics, often as young and beautiful figures that personified the charm and vitality of nature. Compared to the Greeks, the Romans tended to focus more on the aesthetics and the figure of the nymph as a symbol of youth and eternal beauty. During the Middle Ages, the role of nymphs was significantly transformed. While ancient beliefs in natural divinities were eclipsed by Christianity, nymphs did not disappear completely. Instead of being seen as mythological beings linked to the natural world, they often reinterpreted as allegories of beauty and temptation. 1. The concept of the Lady of the Forest. In medieval literature, nymphs or figures similar to them, such as fairies, were presented as mysterious and often dangerous figures that inhabited the forests. These stories reflected the fear of the unknown and the symbolism of the wild and the hidden. Through these figures, issues of temptation, morality, and the power of nature were explored. 2. The Renaissance of interest in antiquity. Despite the Christianization of Europe, during the Renaissance there was a resurgence of interest in ancient mythologies, including Greek and Roman. Nymphs were rediscovered as symbols of beauty and freedom, inspiring artists and writers to portray them in their works. In Renaissance painting, nymphs began to be represented again as figures of nature, a mixture of the earthly and the divine. In the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism, nymphs were a popular figure again, this time as representations of the soul of nature and the mysterious and indomitable elements of the natural world. This period saw a rebirth of fascination with the mythical and the supernatural, where nymphs embodied ideals of unattainable freedom and beauty. 1. Romanticism and connection with nature. The Romantic poets and painters found in the nymphs a vehicle to explore the human relationship with nature, wild beauty, and the sublime. Artists like John William Waterhouse and poets like William Blake and Lord Byron portrayed nymphs as ethereal beings, joining the human with the divine and the natural. these representations reflected a vision of nature as something beautiful and dangerous. 2. The vision of the mystical and the fantastic. The fascination with the mystical and the fantastic caused the nymphs to be seen as transcendent beings, representing the spiritual connection with the natural world and the supernatural. In the literature and art of the time, nymphs acquired a new dimension as figures of the unattainable, whose beauty and mystery incited both admiration and fear. In the 20th and 21st century, nymphs have experienced a continuous adaptation, being included in films, books, video games, and other forms of popular entertainment. His representation has evolved, but his symbolism remains a key reference to explore nature, beauty, femininity, and the mystical. 1. Cinematographic and literary adaptations. The nymphs have been adapted in a wide variety of media, from the films of The Lord of the Rings to series such as Sabrina and The Witcher. In these contemporary representations, nymphs are presented as magical beings that protect nature and have supernatural power, but also as complex characters with their own motivations. 2. The impact on popular culture. In modern fantasy literature, nymphs have been included in worlds where magic, beauty, and struggle for nature protection are recurrent issues. This reflects a return to the original symbolism of nymphs as guardians of the wild and the divine. Throughout history, nymphs have played a central role in culture, mythology, and art. From its origin in ancient Greece, through its adaptation in Rome, its revaluation during the Renaissance, to its impact on contemporary literature and cinema, nymphs remain a constant source of inspiration. His cultural legacy is a testimony of human fascination for the divine, the natural, and the mysterious, and his presence endures as a reminder of our eternal connection with the world around us. Nymphs, as mythological figures deeply connected to nature, spirituality, and creativity, offer a series of timeless lessons for humanity. Beyond their roles in ancient myths and stories, nymphs symbolize values and principles that can inspire us to reflect on about our relationship with the environment, with others, and with ourselves. This chapter is dedicated to exploring these teachings and how to apply them in our modern lives. Nymphs embody the connection between humans and the natural world. As guardians of rivers, forests, mountains, and seas, they remind us of the importance of caring for and respecting the environment. Lesson: nature is not an infinite resource, but a delicate system that requires our respect and care. Just as nymphs protected sacred landscapes, we must assume responsibility for preserving the natural world for future generations. Application: practicing sustainability, reducing our ecological impact, and looking for ways of living in harmony with the environment are modern ways to honor this teaching. Often described as beautiful and serene, nymphs symbolize inherent beauty in simple and natural things. Lesson: true beauty lies in ostentation, but on authenticity and connection with the essential. Finding joy in everyday life and in the purity of natural helps us to live full and conscious lives. Application: practice gratitude for small things. A dawn, the sound of a river, or the tranquility of a forest can enrich our perspective and approach a more balanced life. Nymphs were often seen as muses of artists, poets, and musicians. Its influence in the arts reflects the importance of searching and channeling inspiration. Lesson: creativity is a form of connection with something bigger than ourselves. Just as the nymphs inspired the artists of antiquity, we must seek our own sources of inspiration and allow our imagination to flourish. Application: explore artistic activities. Surrounding ourselves with beauty and opening to new experiences allows us to unlock our creative potential and finding new ways of expressing ourselves. Although they are benevolent beings, nymphs could also be capricious or even dangerous if they were treated with disdain or disrespect. This dual aspect of its nature reflects the contradictions of life. Lesson: life is full of dualities, light and darkness, calm and storm, creation and destruction. Accepting these polarities helps us face the challenges with greater wisdom and resilience. Application: instead of avoiding the difficult or uncomfortable aspects of life, we can learn to hug them as opportunities to grow and better understand ourselves and the world. Nymphs were often represented as free, independent, and carefree figures by the restrictions of the human world. This quality makes them symbols of freedom and personal authenticity. Lesson: true freedom comes from being faithful to ourselves and living in alignment with our deepest values. Application: reflecting on our priorities and making decisions that respect our essence can help us live with greater authenticity and purpose. Nymphs were considered divine beings, but they lived the natural and daily world. This link between the sacred and the mundane reminds us that spirituality does not always need complex rituals, but a deep connection with what surrounds us. Lesson: the divine is present in all aspects of life, from the beauty of a landscape to the acts of goodness. Application: incorporating mindfulness practices, meditation, and gratitude in our daily routines can help us rediscover the sacred in everyday life. Nymphs rarely appear alone in myths, they are usually in groups, working together and supporting each other. This reflects the importance of relationships and communities in our lives. Lesson: force does not always come from the individual, but from the group. Authentic connections and mutual support are essential for our emotional and spiritual well-being. Application: dedicating time to cultivating our relationships, building significant communities and helping others strengthen both individuals and society as a whole. Nymphs represent the unknown and the magical, reminding us that the world is full of wonders beyond our understanding. Lesson: life is a trip full of surprises, and it is important to maintain an open and curious attitude towards what we do not know. Application: embrace the unknown, explore new ideas, and allow us to dream of the impossible helps us to keep our curiosity alive and find magic on a day-to-day basis. Nymphs, as mythological symbols, offer a wisdom that transcends time. They represent our connection with nature, our ability to create, our search for freedom, and our relationship with the sacred. When reflecting on their stories and symbolism, we can learn to live with greater harmony, authenticity, and purpose in a mund or increasing surrounds. Throughout history, nymphs have been lasting symbols of beauty, nature, and mystery. Its presence has transcended the epochs, from classical mythology to contemporary art, embodying universal values that resonate in collective imagination. This chapter explores how nymphs have maintained their relevance and how their eternal beauty remains a source of inspiration in the modern world. Nymphs are the personification of pure and natural beauty, far from artificial ornaments. They represent the connection between humanity and the natural environment, and their image evokes the serenity and perfection of the landscapes they inhabited. Reflection: the beauty of nymphs is not just physical, it is also spiritual, linked to harmony and authenticity. This concept has inspired poets, artists, and thinkers over the centuries. From the poems of ancient Greece to the works of modern literature, nymphs have been muses for innumerable writers. Homer, Hesiod, Virgil, and Ovid immortalized their charm in texts that are still studied and enjoyed. Eternal presence, the figure of the nymph has evolved, but its essence remains. In romantic poetry, for example, it became a symbol of nostalgia for lost nature and the desire for a return to the essential. In painting, sculpture, and other forms of visual art, nymphs have been represented in various styles and contexts, from Greek amphory to the canvases of Renaissance and Baroque painting. Visual evolution: while in ancient times they were portrayed in natural scenarios, in the Renaissance its image acquired an idealized character that emphasized grace and sensuality. In modern art, its representation has become more abstract, often symbolizing concepts of freedom and spiritual connection. In contemporary literature, cinema, and television, nymphs continue to appear as fascinating characters, often adapted to new contexts. Whether they are guardians of magical forests or water spirits in fantasy stories, its essence remains intact. Modern example: in fantastic literature, nymphs are often combined with other mythological elements to create rich and complex universes, as in the works of authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis. Nymphs represent universal concepts such as youth, immortality, and connection with the natural world. These ideas are timeless, which explains their constant presence in human imagination. Current relevance: in an increasingly urbanized and disconnected world of nature, nymphs remain a reminder of the importance of maintaining that essential link with our environment. At present, nymphs symbolize more than beauty, they are a call to sustainability, creativity, and spirituality. Its image adapts to the needs of each era, maintaining its relevance and attractiveness. Eternal lesson: nymphs teach us that true beauty lies in connection with the essential and respect for what surrounds us. The eternal beauty of nymphs does not lie only in their physical forms, but on what they represent: a harmonious union between the human and the natural, between the earthly and the divine. This symbolism has allowed them to continue in collective imagination throughout history, inspiring new interpretations in each generation. In the modern world, its legacy is still alive, reminding us of the importance of nature, creativity, and mystery in our lives. Nymphs, with their eternal beauty, will continue to captivate and guide humanity in their search for balance, inspiration, and meaning. Nymphs have been an essential component of Greek mythology, and their influence has transcended the borders of time, adapting to new cultural interpretations and contexts. This chapter analyzes how its legacy remains in force in modern mythology and collective consciousness, offering a connection between the past and the present. Nymphs represent the essence of Greek mythology, the harmonious interaction between the human and the divine, the natural and the supernatural. As intermediaries between the gods and mortals, their role remains a reminder of the importance of nature and its spiritual connection with humanity. Iconic representation: in mythology, nymphs personify vital forces and elements of nature, which makes them eternal symbols of life, beauty, and change. Although times have changed, nymphs remain as fundamental figures in reinterpretations modernas of Greek mythology. In contemporary literary, cinematographic, and artistic works, nymphs remain inspiration for stories of fantasy, romanticism, and spirituality. Notable examples: in fantastic literature, such as the works of Rick Riordan or Neil Gaiman, nymphs appear as guardians of nature and spiritual guides, keeping classic myths alive in an accessible language for new generations. The symbolism of nymphs has found a place in modern spiritual movements, where they represent the connection between the human being and nature. They also symbolize the balance between the material and the ethereal, a recurring theme in discussions on sustainability and ecology. Contemporary example: many neo-Pagan traditions have adopted nymphs as protective figures of the earth, relating them to the veneration of nature spirits. The legacy of the nymphs is manifested in the visual arts, from Renaissance art to contemporary representations in films, series, and video games. These media have reinterpreted to the nymphs, maintaining their cultural relevance and renewing their aesthetic attraction. Cinema and television: nymphs appear in fantasy and mythology films, such as A Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, or series like Hercules and Xena, the warrior princess, where they personify supernatural wisdom and beauty. Video games: in popular titles such as God of War or Assassin's Creed Odyssey, nymphs are represented as guardians of nature and sources of magical power. In the current context, nymphs have acquired a new meaning as symbols of the need to protect the environment. Its connection with natural elements resonates in ecological movements, highlighting the importance of caring for and preserving natural resources. Modern reinterpretation: in a world where climatic crisis is a global concern, nymphs represent an ideal of coexistence and respect for nature. Nymphs not only symbolize nature, but also universal emotions and concepts such as love, freedom, and inspiration. His ability to resonate emotionally with humanity ensures that they remain relevant in modern narrative. The legacy of the nymphs teaches us that mythology is not only a collection of ancient stories, but a living source of wisdom and meaning. Through them, we remember our connection with the natural world and with our own spirituality. Nymphs remain essential figures of Greek mythology, adapting to modern contexts without losing their essence. From literature and art to ecology and spirituality, its lasting legacy reflects a deep connection with what it means to be human in a constant change. In modern mythology and in cultural consciousness, nymphs continue to inspire, guide, and remind us of the importance of beauty, nature, and balance in our lives. Its influence shows that, although myths evolve, their